You are brave souls. You're diving into session 127 of an ongoing series, but that's fine because part of the way that we do this is we take our time with the text and we're go back to first principles and relate it to other things in our lives that we know about to try to get different perspectives on it. So really, you can drop in anytime. There's just always going to be this backlog of additional stuff you can ask about or that may come up. So this is the Kenneth Smith seminar, and the series that we've been on for 127 sessions so far is a Millennia and Microcosm. Millennia and Microcosm is a forthcoming book from philosopher Kenneth Smith. It was originally written and serialized in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it hasn't yet been put together into book form, but David and I are working on that for Kenneth. We are in chapter 5. The plan of the book overall is that it breaks European history into. Hi, Geneva. Welcome to the call. The book breaks European history into three epochs: the ancient epoch, the medieval epoch, and the modern epoch. And the goal of the book is to teach us how to see and understand the world through each of the three worldviews that correspond to these three epochs. And that involves getting outside of the trap of the modern worldview. Normally, we look at the world, even when we imagine how would a caveman see the world, how would an ancient person see the world, we don't actually try to do justice to their perspective. We try to make them a caricature that we can point and laugh at as primitives or savages or early versions of ourselves. And that's if we're trying at all. Frequently we just assume that they saw the world exactly the way we do, none of which is true. Kenneth Smith's trying to show us that it's possible to look at the world from multiple worldviews if you invest the time and effort to do that. And if you learn how to do that, then you escape the trap of modernity. You escape the trap of thinking that the modern way of seeing the world is the only way or the only right way. And you sort of learn that as mortals, we have limited perspectives on a very complex cosmos, and that we can't just settle for a single worldview or a single perspective. We need to try to learn different worldviews from different cultures so that we can look at reality from different angles. And hopefully, really different worldviews from our own will allow us to look into some of the blind spots that our perspective has. And so we can compensate for the problems with the modern worldview by supplementing it with these additional ones. And likewise, the modern worldview can see some things that the medievals couldn't and some things that the ancients couldn't, and vice versa. So the goal is to get out of sort of the monomania of assuming there's one right worldview and we're all going to duke it out to see who wins. And instead, we're learning to have a toolbox and bring different tools to each different problem depending on what the strengths and weaknesses of a given worldview are for the situation in question. We are in chapter 5. Chapter 5 introduces the medieval worldview. This is a very good time to come into the seminar, despite the fact that we're 127 into this. My prediction, and I could be selling it short, is that we're going to be going for another 4 years on Millennia and Microcosm. And that's because it took us 2 years to get through the ancient worldview, which is, we really had to struggle to get out of the trap of interpreting the ancients the way that the moderns do, and to try to say, well, how could they see the world radically differently than we do? Having done that experiment, we're now starting into the process of saying, well, how is the medieval worldview different from the ancient worldview? That's really the focus of chapter 5, which makes it a great point to jump in. So that's what we're doing. That's what this is about. And we're in paragraph 8. Paragraph 8 is still continuing the process of introducing differences. What are things that are very different between the medieval worldview and the ancient worldview? And part of what's interesting about paragraph 8, which we talked about last week, is the idea that in the ancient worldview, Kenneth Smith's focus was on the Greeks. He really focused on them as sort of characterizing the ancient epoch and worldview at its best. And he really gave short shrift to the Romans, which we noted at the time when we were going through chapter 4. Well, here we are in chapter 5, where he's starting to introduce medievalism, and he's doing a rapid summary in paragraphs 7 and 8 of the Roman period. Now, the Roman period is many centuries long, but he's really just blowing through this history, and he's blowing through it because he mainly is characterizing it as a betrayal. as a corruption of the ancient worldview. Using the ancient Greek Hegelian way of modeling epochs as organisms, each one has its period where it rises, in reaction against the worldview that preceded it or the epoch that preceded it. It rises to power. It flourishes for a time until its own internal contradictions start to lead to its own corruption. And the late stage of an epoch is a corrupt period in which it betrays all the promises that it made at the beginning of the epoch when it said, why should you throw out the old epoch and come to ours? Well, because we won't make the following mistake. That's what they say at the beginning. But by the end, they're typically making mistakes so horrible that it really provokes the need to get out of that epoch, to get out of that worldview and find some new way of seeing the world, some new way of organizing human affairs. So because we're at the beginning of the discussion of the medieval period, the medieval epoch is very much defining itself in opposition to the ancient epoch. But the ancient epoch that it's opposed to is not the ancient Greek Athenian one with which it has no experience. It is the ancient as exemplified by the Roman Empire and its maximal corruption. And this is why, as we've said before, Augustine titles his great work The City of God in direct opposition to the concept of Rome as the city of man. Rome represents to him everything that goes wrong when you put people in charge. This is why we have to put God in charge, is because, God, look at Rome. this is the premise. So in paragraph 8, we're Kenneth is giving us a quick capsule, takedown of Rome. We talked about this last week. We introduced paragraph 8 for the first time. We're gonna talk about it a little bit more this week. I've put some links and connections in here, but our main focus this week is to go on to paragraph 9. Much of chapter 5 so far has been showing how the medievals turn ancient value systems on their head. One core concept after another, things that were considered to be a virtue in the ancient world are depicted in the medieval world as a sin, as the worst of all things. You shouldn't do that. The rejection of polytheism and replacement with monotheism, the rejection of pride and replacement with humility, the rejection of the concept of a lifelong struggle to better yourself, and its replacement with throwing yourself, at God's mercy and hoping for the grace of God to save you. There's a lot of fundamental changes in the concepts of how the world works. What's going to be interesting about paragraph 9 is, for a change, instead of, for us, it's shocking having spent all this time to see the good in the ancient Greek worldview, alongside the bad, of course, but to see the good. In paragraph 9, he's going to show us how the medievals aren't just a fall from that goodness, but are also a rise from the badness of the corruption of Rome. There's sort of a general theme that we're going to get to. But first, I want to run us through paragraph 8 again, because we have some more things to talk about in it. So I'm going to pause here. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I would try this concept I had, which didn't meet with great results when I tried it with a Kant scholar and a Heideggerian scholar. But my thought is that this decisive moment really happened with Plato. And my thought is that there was a tensional relationship in relationship to being, which is existing in the world, and ideas. And it occurred to me that at that moment, human beings have acquired enough know-how, in a sense, create the concept of understanding through intellect in some way. But it could be taken in two ways. The first way is that it was an attempt, in a sense, for the finite mind to reach into the infinite mind of God. And that was one way that the medieval took it. But I think Plato was, in some sense, not going to that way, but looking only on a philosophical way. of trying to understand the world through the limited means of understanding human beings, mostly through creating a kind of uh, a new ecology of human understanding within the city, within the system of understanding itself, limited, which is what wisdom is about, which is what philosophy is about. And instead of, let's say, reaching toward the divine, which the medieval took it as, you know, the city of God, let's put it that way. He was trying to create a city of man with a limited understanding. In fact, he was rebelling against the gods, which is uh, which is the ecology of nature. Okay, rebelling against the gods because we got the technos to create a new ecology in some sense, and in this rebellion, it's sort of like no, he's kind of like fighting against, if anybody, if not Athena, certainly Zeus, which represents the epoch of the gods which emerge in nature. And so this development of the second ecology, of course, the first ecology they didn't recognize was the ecology, was just nature. Uh, it began to develop civilization in a much, much more profound way. And that tension existed uh, uh, through the modern era, which essentially still adapted a lot of the divine idealism, which is called, which turned into theories, uh, in relationship to existence. So there's a struggle between theories and existence, and that tension. The reason why I got that uh, idea was that I was listening to uh, Voyager 2, which just broke through the heliopause, okay, which was the cosmos at that time was understood, had gone into the, uh, in a sense, the true uh, void of the space. And it turned out, at least at the heliopause, there was a tension between the uh, the sun's magnetosphere struggling against the cosmic magnetosphere. So that's actually what the cosmic line divides between the terrestrial and the terrestrial. And Voyager 2 found that within that relationship between the terrestrial and the cosmos, there was a lot more radiation and struggle in the push. And that tension between the terrestrial and the celestial was not a smooth transition to to the city of God, but a tensional relationship that always existed, that somehow human beings, for whatever reason, understood that there was a tensional relationship between uh, uh, theory, absolute ideas, and existential reality of being. So that the relationship between ideas and beings is actually what we exist in. And we had anticipated that relationship was a tensional balance between the two. And in some sense, we are now in the heliopause. And that's why there is this tensional dynamics that we can't decide which way to go in terms of the city of God or in existential existence in that tensional relationship. And it seems to me it's a much more dynamic relationship than the smooth sailing from the terrestrial to the city of God. And that's, and, and so it's interesting that Hegel did say the hour of Minerva take flight at dusk. We are at the dusk of what true existence is about, between being and, and existence. Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, it's been all along, and we would not have known this if we have not developed a kind of instrumental mind that allow us to go beyond just reacting to existence as all other living beings are in some sense. So for some
Yes,
reason we exist in the heliopause. So let's put it that way. Okay, so that was my idea.
that's a great
It did
thing.
not receive a good reaction because it seems like you're either on one side or the other side. You can't exist in the uh, divided middle. So
Yes,
that's
yes.
my thought. I thought I would I thought I would try it out here and see if it get better reception.
It's nice, Phil. Thank you. Yes, and it's characteristic of chapter five. I mean, chapter five, we're talking about the transition between the ancient world and the medieval world, and that transition is very much like you're saying, that transitional zone between the heliosphere and the interstellar medium in astronomy, it's a mess. I mean, you've got eddies and currents and swirls and conflict and dynamism and a certain amount of chaos, right? That this is that ancient Greek concept of the fundamental distinction between cosmos and chaos. The organism that's healthy is a cosmos. It's a little universe unto itself that maintains itself and manages itself. And this is that fundamental, for those who've just joined us this week, that's that fundamental metaphor that the ancient Greeks used for everything. To them, the universe isn't a place full of things. It's a giant organism made up of other organisms, made up of other organisms. Even a stone to them is a kind of organism, although a very primitive one. But so when they look at history or an epoch, they see it as an organism. They say, what are the forces, going back to comments that Steve made, very early on in the sessions. What is the balance between the centripetal forces that are holding the organism together into a cosmos and the centrifugal forces that are causing the organism to fall apart into a chaos? And so during these periods of transition, the old order has become more obviously a chaos than it was a cosmos. And now it's intolerable because we can't get anything done. We can't solve our problems because all of our institutions and systems are structured in such a way that all of our efforts are being defeated by everybody else's efforts. And we're not helping each other, we're hindering each other. And so when the new order arises from within that, it is attempting to impose a new order, but because that order is incompatible with the old order, for a while it generates greater chaos than existed there before.
Let me add one additional thing I expressed. I talked about Bach. Before Bach, of course, we have already discovered the major minor uh, uh, modality of the 12-tone zone. And the problem, once again, it comes up with technology and invention. The problem with inventing the keyboard, in which case is the harpsichord, and later became the piano, was that before the invention of the harpsichord, a kind of almost like a digital, a digital relationship. Uh, Violins and other string instruments and actually wind instruments, you could blow or you could scale in a kind of microtone and switch from one to another. And so there was a struggle between the just intonation, which is pure intonation, and temper intonation. Okay. And so Bach, the question is, was he inventing a new system or was he sustaining an old system? And it came to a different moment in 1960. It was very, very interesting when Glenn Gould wanted to perform Bach's uh, harpsichord concerto, but the piano concerto. And and what's his name? The composer, I mean the conductor, Leonard Bernstein, actually refused to make that performance with the one proviso that he would allow to say why he disagreed with Glenn Gould. And they gave him the permission to do that. And he says, I actually disagree with Glenn Gould's interpretation, but seeing that he's a very, very creative an important artist, I thought I would give him a try anyway. So with that proviso, he conducted. The question is that to the degree that Leonard Bernstein was himself somewhat iconoclastic
Yeah.
himself as well as being with a tradition. He was operating in the middle ground, let's put it that way. It was performed. It was a beautiful interpretation. And I
Yes.
think Glenn Gould decided that Bach was an innovator by transforming that. And
Yes.
therefore, instead of making him the static structure for the composition that went before, through Mozart and Beethoven and so forth, why shouldn't he take on the iconoclastic position of breaking the system in some sense? So there's always been a tension between the desire to break the system and maintain the system. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
That happened again in Picasso, who essentially broke the system to create a new structure to
Yes.
do it, but it quickly evolved into uh, Mondrian, who reclassified the system in a new way, but it created a new stasis called, I guess, uh, a kind of neo Neoplatonist classicism. Okay, so in some sense, that tension between wanting to push ahead and also remain stable so they have a basis to push ahead, that there's a duality that we exist in to what some degree. To what degree should you be an iconoclast in order to open up the possibility for the new
Yes.
way of seeing, and to what degree you need the stable ground to not go chaotic? I think that's a tension that we exist in, and I think that 1960, when Glenn Gould made
Yes.
that play, was a very, very important moment, because
Yes.
that was questioning exactly the relationship between how much should we stay with the system and how much should we break the system. That's it.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for adding that. I have those recordings. They're still to this day on the short list of like the top 10 performances of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Is that collaboration between Gould and yes. So um, I could go on at some length. All of us could go on at some length about this. There's a lot to be said about the chaos that's caused during these periods of translation. One of the things we talked about in earlier weeks, in the past month or two about chapter 5, is this idea that we'd mentioned before that the difficulty of understanding the ancient worldview is that every major term, nature, God, man, slavery, free will, good, bad, all of those terms, they had definitions to the ancients that were fundamentally alien to our definitions. And that when we read Aristotle and we read into the translation, the modern definitions of the words, we're completely misrepresenting what Aristotle's saying. And the classic example is the term sophrosune, which we translate as practical intelligence, which is exactly what it isn't. I mean, Aristotle couldn't be clearer. Practical intelligence is the thing that he contrasts with sophrosune and talks about how inadequate practical intelligence is. And what you need is sophrosune instead. And, rendering sophrosune as meaning practical intelligence turns Aristotle into gibberish, in which he's saying, the problem, practical intelligence is a major problem in our lives. And it's the solution to the problem of practical intelligence is you need to get yourself some practical intelligence. And that sentence doesn't make any sense. But to a modern, we can't imagine anything better than practical intelligence. So sophrosune is an invisible, untranslatable concept. So we talked about it in those terms in chapter 4. What we're seeing in chapter 5 now, and this alludes to the fact that I'm going to come back to it in a second. It alludes to the fact that of these three epochs of medieval history, the medieval one is the only epoch where we have documented both the beginnings and the endings. We know what came before it and how it arose, and we know what came after it and how it collapsed. In the case of the ancient epoch, we don't know exactly when or how it arose. And in the case of the modern epoch, we don't know exactly when or how it ends. And so the result is that we can see certain things in the medieval. Part of what's going to make this section, the middle section of this book, so interesting, is that there are things that we can learn about epochs and worldviews from the medieval epoch that we can't learn from either of the other two, because the other two are, we only have part of the picture. So part of what's interesting, we talked about this last week and the week before about chapter 5, is we're getting to see the process of change in language. We have Cicero and Caesar and Virgil and other writers who offer us classical Latin, Latin from the ancient perspective. But then we have medieval Latin, ecclesiastical Latin, which is very different. It's even though in theory it's the same language, the definitions of, and this goes back to what we said in chapter 4, all of the important terms for understanding the world have changed, in many cases inverted. What is good and what is bad have completely flipped over right in the definitions of the words. I'm starting into the process of learning Latin, and one of the things that becomes clear when you look at the different varieties of Latin that exist is that there is a variety called patristic Latin. And patristic Latin specifically refers to the way that the early church fathers set about the project of redefining all the important words, so that instead of being words about how to rule the Roman Empire, they became words about how to adhere to the emerging religious orthodoxy. What was their theology and how could you comply with it and not get into trouble became, the motivation for redefining all of these terms, like virtue. The virtu of the Romans, the manliness that makes one fit to rule, is a very different creature from the virtue of Augustine and Boethius and Aquinas, which has to do with, how do you avoid hell and get to heaven? How do you figure out what God wants from you and do that thing? These are really radically alien concepts, and they're using the same word, literally spelled the same way, written with the same letters. And if you don't know which context the author is bringing to the word that he's writing, you have no idea what you're reading. You're just going to impose something on top of it. And God help you if you stick the modern definition of virtue, which doesn't apply to either Cicero or Augustine. It's just has no place in there. Stephen, come off. To close out what Phil was saying, it's the chaos, right? This is what the Greeks warn us about. This is the chaos of the turbulence of the old worldview and the new worldview struggling against each other during this transitional period, in which you have to know who's writing to figure out how to decode the sentence. And you also have to know how far along in the process are we of disengaging from the ancient worldview and entering into the medieval worldview, so that you know what nuance to apply. It's unlike, you read some of the early church fathers like Athanasius, and he's in between the two. He sees he's got a version of the religious orthodoxy in which nature still has a role to play. It hasn't been sucked, all the meaning hasn't been sucked out of nature yet. He still has the ancient naturalistic concept of nature as a source of authority and meaning, but within the new theological context. So what he's saying with great sincerity in his writings in the 300s is very different from what Augustine and Aquinas are going to be saying later using the same words, even though in theory he's a church father too. So this whole period, it's like Phil said, this is the termination shock zone. This is the beyond the heliopause into the period where now we've got the interstellar medium and the winds there struggling against the solar winds, which are weakening. We're in that halfway stage. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, in reference to what Bill said about the change of mind, of course, famously, we talk about this, the era of Plato was a type of rationality had appeared. As he says, Smith claimed, the later Greek philosophers look back on the sort of stuff the early Greeks were coming up, Jupiter turning into a swan and impregnating maidens. And it was a bit beyond their understanding, their own ancient culture. They didn't understand they couldn't understand the people that weren't operating on the later rational principles. A contributing factor was probably the development of sophisticated trade. This was a world where, you know, you'd go to the port and vast amounts of stuff were just moving through. Money had been invented to make things easy. I have heard somebody claim that with the invention of money, consciousness changed. But what I was going to ask a question about was, well, in this paragraph, he's, you know, making this claim that, you know, the Romans were more like a mafia. I'm not absolutely certain about this truth. Famously, I remember one French philosopher saying, well, it's funny we got so many laws from the Romans because they started out as a gang of cattle thieves and crooks hiding out on the mountain. He said, he also said, well, it's funny, you know, like the Vikings contributed so many law, you know, the jurisprudence as well. So the two biggest gangs of thieves in European history laid the best foundations for a legal process. But I'm not quite sure that, comparatively speaking, that I don't know if the Romans always stood out as a mafia. It's certainly very true of the point where they became an empire, where they defeated the Carthaginians and suddenly they became enormously wealthy. And as we all know, if you give people lots of money, the very best characteristics will always emerge. So the internal culture of the Romans certainly did start to rot from about, you know, 100, 180 BC, 150 BC. And then we have the period of the Roman civil wars when the various oligarchs were fighting for dominance until they finally got one oligarch big and smart enough to rule them all. And of course, presently people are claiming that the American culture is going through the same process. This decline when the Roman Republic had become an empire and the republican system couldn't handle what the imperial strains. And America, in a sense, is an empire, and it can't handle that empire with its democratic system. So they've created a power vacuum. And somebody like dear old Donald will step in to that vacuum. But I'm just curious, does he really think that all through that early Republican period of Rome that they were all stand-up gangsters compared to, say, the Greeks? But I can, like I said, I can agree with that period of the civil wars as the Republic fell. But what about the periods before the Carthaginian War? Was it always the case? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, certainly the Romans themselves thought that they started out as a gang of cattle thieves and murderers and rapists. It's part of where we get this idea is it's part of what's shocking about the ancients. We talked about this in chapter 4. Those of us who were just joining this week might not know this about the ancient culture. Despite the fact that it ends during the Roman period with so much lying and conning. I mean, there's an enormous amount of lying and conning that's happening under the Roman Empire. It starts out with this weird amount of honesty in which people were less concerned with image and more concerned with the warrior ethos of being candid. And they were willing to sacrifice an enormous amount to that warrior ethos. And so there's this speech in Thucydides, and I think I put it up there in what I just posted. The Melian dialogue, it's called, from the history of the Peloponnesian War, where Thucydides is trying to illustrate how far Athens has fallen, how far its character is rotten, to the point where they're not ruled by persuasion and reason anymore. They're ruled by brute force. And he does this interesting thing where he has the Athenian representatives talking to the doomed people of Melos. They're speaking across, they've got people on the walls and they're They're shouting up to each other. And Thucydides reconstructs their speech by having the Athenians basically say, well, yes, it's true, perhaps it's true that you've never done anything to harm us, but we're stronger than you, so we can crush you. So you should really surrender now, and maybe we won't hurt you as bad. Because, if we have to take the walls, then we're going to murder you all. And Thucydides gives us this example to show, just how far the Athenians have fallen. And what's striking is that in Thucydides' effort to write a realistic history, he thinks it's realistic to have the Athenians say, we're horrible, awful people, and we're just going to murder you all. He felt that his fellow Greeks would read that passage and go, yeah, that sounds like us. If we were that way, we would say it. We would say who we are. We wouldn't be so focused on our brands, on covering up the truth and trying to live a lie. We would tell you, here we come. Now, a few centuries later, this has completely changed, and there's an enormous amount of lying and deception that happens under the Roman Empire. Tacitus and others make clear that to survive, you have to lie under the empire. We're going to come to that today. And it introduces an extreme level of dishonesty. It makes it normal to make a distinction between your true character and your brand. And you try to create a brand that isn't who you really are, but that is who you think other people will reward you for being. And then you work very carefully never to reveal your true character, but only to show your brand. So, but if we go back to the earlier Roman Republican period, we see before the empire is kicked in, back when people still in Rome still think that it's okay to have rhetorical debates where it's safe, you can actually honestly talk to each other about your different positions. Back during that period, the Roman version of their own history was our ancestors sucked. They were bandits and brigands and rapists. We were terrible people, and that presented an embarrassment.
And we were proud of it.
And well, we may or may not be proud of it, but by the time we get to Augustus, Augustus is ashamed of it, and that's why Virgil, in order to curry favor with Augustus, writes the Aeneid. Let us invent a bullshit history that makes us sound like we came from nobility. And since we've conquered the Greeks and they have this amazing epic, why don't we write it as fanfic? We'll insert ourselves into our Star Trek fantasy here. And, yeah, you've got Captain Kirk, but, I'm going to now tell you the stories of, Captain so-and-so, Captain Aeneas, of the Starship Rome, and how he escaped, the destruction of the Starship Enterprise and founded his own new, it's fanfic. Right? The Aeneid is fanfic. And it's not just fanfic. It's fanfic purporting to be a new truth that is more socially acceptable to replace the old truth that we all already know. In Rome, we all feel, that yes, our ancestors are brigands, but let's all make believe that they're not. There's a very weird thing that's going on in Virgil and the Aeneid. But when we look at it and we compare it to the earlier story, what it tells us is, we may not know exactly how Rome started. And I put a link in this whole bunch of things I did there. I put a link to the Wikipedia article that shows what we know archaeologically so far about the founding of Rome. We may not know, but the Romans themselves thought that they started out as a bunch of assholes. That's what they thought. They thought, Romulus murdered Remus. He's a murderer. And then after they had their settlement, there were too many men and not enough women, so they raped a whole bunch of women. They stole a bunch of women and forcibly married them. Yay, go Rome! This is who they thought they were.
Well, the most important thing is virility. Yes,
virility, of course, manliness. Right, weird too means manliness. You want to be a man. You don't want to be womanish. That would be terrible. God knows what would happen. Maybe we'd be nice to each other. We can't have any of that. And I think you're right, Stephen, that even though Augustus is ashamed of those bandit origins and receptive to Virgil spinning this beautiful lie for him, earlier generations weren't ashamed of it. They were proud of it. They had made a shift from a pantheon of equal divinities that called Romans to have to meet certain obligations in every aspect of their life, like funerary rites and birth rites, and there's all these things you had to do to be considered a good Roman. But by the time we get to the late Republic, Rome is having such success militarily that Mars has become, in many ways, as Augustus would later put it, first among the equals. They're obsessed with Mars. They're obsessed with a martial way of life. They're neglecting the other divinities. And at that point, I think you're right. There's widespread pride of the fact that, the early Romans, according to the Republican Romans, were mean motherfuckers. So yeah, don't mess with Rome, huh? We're tough. It's like the people who hang the little metal testicles off the back of their pickup trucks. Manly. I'm scary. Don't mess with me. So
and this other aspect you talk about, I hadn't really thought about it, but I'm experiencing a culture. If I look at what's in the news, when I was a kid, I read the news and I was seeing a lot of well-balanced reporting, very rational reporting.
yes,
Now, 50 years later, I look at what's in the news now, and it doesn't care about the truth. It's all about spinning a line.
yes,
We seem to have adopted that Roman transition in our age as well. I mean, there's a lot of people making this comparison between the Roman Republic and the fall of the Western Republic.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's Walter Cronkite was perhaps the classic example of mid 20th century reporting in which the brand that he was pushing, which he was very serious about pushing, was I don't have a position. I'm only going to do my best to give you the facts, and you make up your own mind about your position from those facts. And now we have the opposite. I mean, Fox News is an example, but really they're all examples. Everyone's trying to push the conclusions they want you to be thinking, rather than saying, I don't, you decide what your conclusion is. I'm just informing you. And that's really a sign, that kind of distortion of the promise of the modernist epoch is analogous to the distortion that happens when, to be a Roman rhetorician, the rhetorical person who makes their living through speeches like Cicero did, means you're going to get a sword in your gut. You're going to die. And when that happens, I've been doing some reading about what's considered to be the end of classical Latin and the rise of late Latin. And a certain number of people attribute it to the collapse of rhetoric, for fear that you'll say something that the next emperor won't like. Maybe the current emperor will, but the next emperor won't. And suddenly you're on record as having said these things. And when the new emperor comes in, you're dead. And so there's this anticipatory fear that causes a great chilling effect in the Roman Empire. And so the whole concept of virtu as manliness, starts to be equated with sudden death, and rhetoric, which was associated with virtu, becomes associated with sudden death. And so people start couching their statements. They start focusing more on comedy and poetry and entertainment, and trying not to take a position.
Sorry, I'm not really getting that phrase, which we say accounts for virility.
Yeah, I put a link there to Wiktionary for virtus. And you see that virtue or goodness is only the third definition. The first definition on the list is manhood, manliness, right? Virility, just like you said, virility.
Virtus. Okay,
yeah.
cool.
Only the V in classical Latin is pronounced like what we would say a W is. So it's virtus, virtus, virtus. But yes, very, very, and in this, we spent how much time?
Order 10,000 t-shirts. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Virtus. So this is something that you see in warrior cultures a lot. You see it among the early Greeks. You see it in traditional Japanese martial arts. There's a famous karate, considered the father of one of the branches of karate, Matsumura, has a letter that he wrote about how to be a good karateka. And in there is an issue about not wanting to be womanly. Don't be womanish. And so, this is what you see when you've got sort of a warrior culture focused on, especially the majority of them are patriarchal. They will associate the men's side with being good and the woman's side with being bad, and then we'll try to put a list of characteristics of what a good man should be like. And the list of characteristics for a bad man will often include the what we would think of as the virtues of women. Don't be kind, don't be soft, don't be generous. These things are bad. You want to be strong and dangerous, and and it's you can see that in the Roman definition of virtus. And in this, you can see why Kenneth Smith makes the argument he does that the Romans don't represent the ancient epoch at their peak, because this is a big shift from the ancient Greek idea of sophrosune, where sophrosune is like, okay, role playing who's the manliest man and who's the womanliest woman is all well and good, but Aristotle says the more important thing is what's healthy for our species. Where does our health and our vitality and our thriving lie? That's the sophrosune. He says if you don't make that your top consideration, everything is gonna rot out from under you, because you're gonna do sick things. You're gonna mistake poison for food, says Aristotle. And the Romans don't have that value system. Even from the beginning, their value system is okay. Might makes right. It's important to be strong. So this is, I'm agreeing with you. And I also want to agree with you, Stephen, in saying that we don't know for sure how Rome got started. To this day, it's unclear. There's, the archaeological digs have to be done carefully because they're right underneath the existing city and underneath thousands of years of really important ruins that you don't want to destroy, So
Actually, I have heard the claim that Rome was actually a substantial village even before the
yeah,
classical era of
yeah.
Romulus and Remus.
You'll see that in the article, in the Wikipedia article I linked to. They talk about for over 1,000 years before Romulus and Remus, we've got Bronze Age peoples setting up on the Capitoline Hills and the other hills in Rome. So yeah, right there with you, Stephen. So thanks for bringing that up. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's on my mind is Augustus. That seems like a very important character. I actually like Augustus, at least at one time. But from what you said, it's interesting. It refers me back to Nixon, because they always say it's not what he did, but his cover up. That was the real problem, okay? Now, did Augustus's beautiful lie about how Rome is so beautiful and wonderful, was that a cover up? If that's a cover up, it's a deeper lie than the horrible stuff that they did before. In other words, you don't even want them to know this. You just eliminated it. So it eliminates virtue from even appearing in an honest way. So that is actually a deeper problem than just saying, well, I'm macho, I'm going to just hit you in the face if you say anything, right? It's
Yeah.
like, but I didn't do it. It's like, that's a lie. So which is deeper? When you actually hit somebody in the face or when you lie about it as a cover up, as a cover up. So the cover up eliminates the possibility of honesty and virtue to happen to begin with, whereas at
Yeah.
least the one time you hit them in the face, yeah, that occurred, but it was not a cover up. So in some sense, that completely changes Augustine Augustine, yeah, uh, from being a good emperor to just somebody who's in the cover-up business
Well,
that allow Rome to exist in a eternal lie of cover-ups. So
let me
that
moderate my
beginning.
statement. Let me moderate my statement. So it goes like this. There's a period of chaos before Augustus comes in, as you know
Yeah.
well. And that period of chaos was really dangerous to live through. That was when Cicero was killed. Augustus didn't kill Cicero. Mark Antony had Cicero executed. And there was great hope with Augustus that what was going to happen was an end to the chaos. Now, because he got in so young, because he lived so long, he was able to, try to. You could think of him as attempting to, from his own perspective, he was trying to be the restorer of Rome and say, that crazy chaos, that's not Rome. You're supposed to be able to be honest, to be open, to be a Roman. to have weird tooths, to be a man. You're supposed to be able to do those things. And he believed that he was reconstructing. I think a lot of people thought that he was reconstructing it. But you have to be really smart about flattery to not let it distort what you're trying to do. And Augustus was young, and Virgil was, quite the flatterer in this regard. So there's a precedent being set there. But I don't think the real problems with people feeling like they can't go back to the old way and they can't speak what's on their mind honestly, they don't really happen under Augustus. They happen under Tiberius.
Yeah,
So
but that's my point, is that yeah, he might have thought he was doing a good thing and restoring things, but
yes,
look at the end result. It was a whole period of cover. I mean, not only Tiberius, but who came after, like the guy
Claudius,
that came after
Nero.
is even worse, and then Nero. I mean, all of them, just one after another, uh, became worse than it was
Yes.
before. In some sense, he might have been attempting to be virtuous, but in some sense, he set a whole precedent that follow him in the history that turned
Yes.
the empire into
Yes.
a whole damn lie.
Yes. He didn't think enough about the issue of it doesn't it how good it is when you're in charge is all well and good, but the question is how good is it going to be when somebody else takes up the office that you've created? Have you created an office such that if a tyrant got into it, that the results would be terrible? And Augustus didn't think that through. And the result is you get an increasingly uncomfortable series of emperors, as Polybius and Suetonius and Tacitus all write about. It's Tiberius, unlike Augustus, who really Augustus gave this impression of loving Rome and Roman culture and the ways of Rome and so forth. Tiberius was a cold fish, and he had not a completely short temper, but let's say he was brooding and dangerous, according to Tacitus and others. And so the result is all kinds of things that people felt like they could get away with and be Romans under Augustus suddenly became not okay under Tiberius. And so the attempt to create order actually created chaos on these disruptive boundaries. And from the ancient perspective, the Greek perspective, chaos is not the opposite of order. It's the opposite of cosmos, which is a completely different concept from order. So what Augustus set in motion is the ability to impose order. But whether it's good order or bad order depends on whether you're imposing a chaos or a cosmos. And so Augustus imposes a cosmos, but Tiberius and increasingly the emperors who follow start imposing, chaoses. Orderly chaos, overly ordered totalitarian order is a chaos. It stifles sophrosune. People can't act to do the right thing, what's healthy or good, or they get in trouble.
Yeah, I was thinking of Caligula.
Yes, well,
That's even worse.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's very interesting. This first 100 years is fascinating, and I put links up there. He talks about Suetonius and Polybius in this paragraph, and I put links to the writings of Suetonius and Polybius, the histories and the 12 Caesars. The 12 Caesars, is by Suetonius is a very interesting work. If you're looking at this very question you raised, Phil, in which he characterizes each of these people and what kind of rule do they impose, and all of this is predicted by the ancient Greeks, isn't it? And Aristotle's writing on politics says, the thing about tyranny is it's great if you've got a king who is in pursuit of sophrosune, who's good character. But once the institution is in place, you're vulnerable. So this is the issue. This is what the Greeks predict, and of course, this is why the Greeks are skeptical about power, because power doesn't just magnify your good qualities; it magnifies your entire character, which means it also magnifies your vices, which is how you set up tragedies. All right. So anyway, thanks for bringing that up, Phil. It's a critical point. And what's ironic is this underscores Kenneth's decision to separate, the ancient world, to put a division between the Greek period and the Roman period, because the Romans are falling prey to these really basic lessons that the Greeks took for granted, that everybody, all the way down to the level of a slave, would be familiar with. But instead, we find the best and the brightest Romans seemingly clueless and blundering right into these kinds of tragic disasters that the Greeks warned against. It's a real collapse from the level of self-awareness that the Greeks had.
Sorry, what period are you referring to exactly here? This is interesting.
We're talking about late Republican, early
Okay.
Imperial Rome, and how even people like Cicero um, are surprised by the consequences of Rome's political economic decisions, where those decisions, the bad side of those decisions is pretty clearly foretold by the Greeks, who in theory, the educated Romans were all learning ancient Greek. They're all reading ancient Greek writings. They're studying the Greeks. Cicero's translating Greek works into Latin. And yet they just are surprised by
This
the
is similar
capacity.
to the early Americans when they prized British culture.
Yes, yes. But they're just like weirdly surprised to find um, what an impact the character of the person has, the negative sides of a person's character have when you give them too much power.
Well, there's an equivalent. That was when Montgomery, the British general, was warning the Americans against going into Vietnam.
Right,
The
right.
Americans didn't listen.
No, we're very Roman that way. Might makes right. Woo, go team, winners win. So yeah, yeah, there are all of these odd parallels, and they're not really accidental, are they? Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey guys, so good to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm just going for a little walk at the same time. I'm listening to everybody and really appreciating, as usual, the very rich and in-depth discussion. I see Joe's got his hand up. I want to maybe give him a little food for thought because I'm going to bring in one of our favorite dynamics to this conversation, which is contingency versus agency. And I want to link it in a way that's I was going to say something more like Phil that might be not well received, possibly because it doesn't really match up. But I'm going to say maybe because it's so foreign to the types of vocabulary and definitions that we have. And it was something that Rick, you had said about the word virtue, the being more a statement of male behavior or manliness, and also something that we don't do very often. I want to bring it right to the text. You'll like me for this. I'm going to quote the part. It's in paragraph 8, sentence 2 and 3. And so it says, what was true among gods and animals, the privileges of hierarchic rank, was no less true among humans. What is permitted to Jove and not permitted to a cow? Religion was tempering in human vices rather than tempering in human voices, was merely ratified the course of an imperial juggernaut. And I think this speaks to what's changing in the dynamics between male and female dynamics. And male and female is often in our modern times such a hot topic because gender is this kind of fluid, rational construction, almost like a nihilistic thing. You can choose it to be whatever you want it to be. Whatever's male is male and whatever's female is female. And it's this, I think that makes sense to some degree because we're rejecting the mythological roles that we have, society has been placing on men and women that don't really match up with what works, or maybe is in some ways just a construct of deceit to lock someone into a certain type of prison of behavior. But I want to go back to maybe more of what an ancient, but I would say universal version of what male and female is from a mystical point of view. And it relates very much to what the Romans are saying, what's manly, and then wherefore what's in charge. And this also relates to characteristics, concepts of self that we can then modify and adjust. And it's the idea that what's male is simply what is revealed, and that is relates to having agency, what we're available to choose between, what we can see and do, and what is female is what is concealed. So it's the relationship between the hidden and the revealed. And this makes a lot of sense with, if you look at the stories of the way women, well, from a biological point of view, the simple is that men have a phallus, right? And that's revealed. And the women have a womb that grows the baby, and that's all hidden. And that's where that would stem from, in the sense that men primarily make what is a transmission, a revealed piece of information that's then goes from one place to another through some sort of controlled mechanism. And then females have this sort of reception or perception and a transformative quality, which is where you get the basis for the sacred feminine, and also this idea of, you know, day being male and female being night. And also you see the traditional classical ways that men would fight is with swords and shields, whoever obviously stronger on the battlefield, and women would manipulate and do things behind the scenes, or even poison people, which is a more, again, a hidden or a concealed way. And this relates to the idea of deceit. Ironically, I don't want to throw women under the bus because it has nothing to do with women. All things in the universe have a revealed and a concealed component. And so to say that women are the deceivers because they're what's hidden is just one negative aspect of what's hidden. Hidden is obviously very transformative, beautiful, if you're talking about growth and metamorphosis. But from a bad actor's point of view, if you want to hurt someone in this Machiavellian sense, later on it talks about, Kenneth Smith talks about, where is it, Machiavellian behavior. Yeah, in sentence 8 through 10, the Machiavellian craft of domination through deception and ruin of opponents. This is an interesting change up between male-female dynamics. And it's almost like you were saying in the very beginning, which is strangely the strange honesty of the Greeks, or maybe the Romans, I'm not sure who you're referring to here, are openly honest. They're very male about what they're going to do to the city if they don't surrender, or if they do surrender. And later on, they put on the brand of what they're doing, which is deceiving their enemies or whoever that they're interacting with. And the Machiavellian version of that full on later is then being very open, being very revealing about how deceitful you're going to be. And so it's this, you'll find that systems that work have a male aspect of what's revealed, partnership, a healthy dynamic between what is female. The revealed sends the information or the energy to the female, and then the female transforms it and then allows another male act to occur. And it would seem like in ancient times that what's male here is being virtuous, is being male. And this is the idea of having concepts of self through characteristics, through I think they're called daimons, or that's what the we used to talk about this word a long time ago. And it's these aspects of self that are intrinsic to either a cheetah or a human. We have these behaviors, and we try to cultivate them. But they're kind of what is revealed about the organism or person. What are these traits? And that would be their manly sense, part of ourselves, the unconscious part, almost like in the Freudian sense. We don't have access to this so much. We know it affects us. And this very much relates to then what religion is doing, and then also what journalism is doing in our modern society and how that's transformed. And I think that very much relates to the idea of words themselves changing. It was Stephen who said it, and Rick also sort of reflected on this idea of money changing our consciousness. Why does that make sense? How does that work? Our consciousness is based on our descriptions of reality. Descriptions of reality are symbolic representation, which is simply words. And if the words change their definitions and their functions, they're essentially what's being revealed, and what's being hidden is being changed. And the relationship between the hidden and the revealed is changing in the sense where the hidden used to balance the revealed, or the revealed, the rules on what you can modify. Your agency can modify your contingency. But in a messed up sort of sense, when things are transitioning, you see that religion is no longer using words and concepts to balance the the powerful political dynamic of society, which I'd call a race to the bottom. So what we use nowadays for acquiring power and manipulation of things and trying to maximize utility, you see that everyone wants to break the rules in order to get to that position of power. And it was the idea that religion was supposed to temper that. But what changed is the words, I think, within religion themselves and the definitions of what their principles were ultimately by no longer using the old definitions, i.e., what was revealed, and making it hidden, it's no longer serving that component. And you instead having basically a male component and a female component, you have two female components, or in some cases, two male components. And this is in a system dynamics, if anybody wants to think about it this way, like information systems from a good thinker, Donella Meadows, talks about what is, in this case, the cosmos or whatever, is a stock, it's a thing. And there are things, or our civilization, or whatever it is, your organism, its behavior, its relationship is a thing. It has its essential sort of qualities. And then you have flows of information or flows of energy that modify these things. And you can have balancing loops or reinforcing loops. And in this case, the religion was a balancing piece of information, a balancing loop to keep politics and to some degree that race to the bottom in check. And what changed was then instead of balancing it and limiting it, it became an accelerant, almost like instead of water that puts out the fire, the water became gasoline and it triggered the fire. And you have this massive shift. And this is, again, I think mostly predicated on the way that words themselves are changed and their use in society. And I think what's most important, this at least not just for this book, for our lives, the way that journalism and this freedom of journalism to be some sort of thing that limited power of government and power of corporations and keeping a check by keeping that information more of a thing that the population could then validate or invalidate, that has totally changed, where information is now just going to support your tribal mythology, whether it be you're on the right or on the left. And this does seem to see what, like Stephen was saying, this creates a massive power vacuum between essentially almost like a schizophrenic being, where you have a democratic ideology and you have an imperial behavior. And so in this case, which part is male and which part is female? We all can see there's a messed up aspects of both. Our ideals, which are supposed to be, in case revealed to us and bound ourselves through principles or virtues, would be our male characteristics of being a democratic people of a shared population in a shared country, versus what's actually going on, but it's very hidden and deceived, is this very much race to the bottom for specific groups to take over everything.
Right.
And
right.
it's like in our heart, we want to be the old America that idealized England and the other societies and had a religion that allowed us to have a sort of check on our bottom up behavior, on our race to the bottom behavior.
Yes.
And that's gone. That is completely gone. I mean, to some degree, religion lost
I got to
too.
jump in, Ari.
Okay.
You've been going for like 15 minutes.
Oh boy, sorry, I get excited. Yeah, thanks. Okay, that's a good find. That's a good place to stop. That these things are all very much entangled.
They are, and it's exciting stuff. And but this is why we're going to take a good 2 years on the medieval section, is that we have time to really dig into each of these issues. The things you're talking about, this is rich material. And one of the things that's important to understand is that when we talk about virtus as being manliness, of course, we're not saying it's actually manliness. We're saying this is how the Romans imagined it to be. This is how the Romans conceived of their gender roles. One of the fascinating things in studying Anglo-Saxon history, which I did for 20 years, is that in Anglo-Saxon culture, the son is a woman, not a man.
Wow.
The gender roles are very different in pagan Anglo-Saxon culture.
That is interesting.
Men were seen as warriors, yes, but women were seen in Anglo-Saxon culture as the weavers of the peace, the keepers of civilization. not just people
Mhm.
who domestically kept a house going, but literally the whole reason you can have anything more than one caveman clubs another one over the head is because of women from the Anglo-Saxon perspective. They were the politicians, the Democrats, the advisors, the mystics, the ones with all the magic, and they led armies. Athelflaed, daughter of Alfred the Great, led armies and built fortifications. And when the Danish army wanted to surrender to the English, they refused to surrender to her brother, Edward the King. They would only surrender to her because they felt she had more successfully outmaneuvered them. And if she was the greater warrior, and if peace was going to be made, it had to be made with her and not with him. And he was fine with that. He wasn't offended by it or anything because that was the role of women in pagan Anglo-Saxon society. So the trick with this gender roles is to understand that different cultures conceive of what is masculine and what is feminine in radically different ways. But you're right that we're focused here on how the Romans see it, what the Romans imagine manliness or womanliness to be, for sure. And they thought, the purpose of women is to be domestic servants and to reproduce and do all of the icky work of keeping a house going so the men can go out and conquer things.
Right.
By the time we're talking about, with the obsession with Mars as the greatest of the gods, it's men are in the late Roman Republic and early Empire, men have kind of extremized the dichotomy between what they imagine to be male and female.
Uh-huh.
And for sure, what that does, I don't know how much you've seen the films of Ang Lee, the director Ang Lee.
Sure, yeah.
So, one of the things he talks about in interviews is that a recurring theme in all of his films is what happens psychologically to people when their hope to be actors in the world and to fulfill themselves are repressed. What is the effect of repression on the personality? He says all of his films are about that. The Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, very much about the woman who wants to be a hero and an adventurer, but she's into the traditional Chinese marriage. So what does she do?
Of course.
She runs out at night, becomes a great martial arts warrior bandit, and steals the sword, because she won't be constrained into these roles. So for sure, the things you're talking about are relevant to Roman history. You're going to see, in the times we're talking about, we're going to see a lot of things about how noble Roman women denied a voice in the Senate or anywhere else, try to manipulate their children and their husbands into living the life that they wish that they could live. And it creates this seething resentment and, passive aggressive relationships and the deception you're talking about. All of that.
I think it's important to note that it would seem as the race to the bottom happens more, that the men of the society who might, I have no idea if they actually believe this is good or bad, but they'll, instead of doing things openly and powerfully in a revealed sense, they'll do it in a hidden, deceitful way, because that's what the system requires, this sort of thing. And I'm not trying to say it's good or bad, or that it's inherently what men or women are like, but it's this classic phallus versus curvature relationship between men and women that's not really, again, not universally played out perfectly. You're saying that men and women also, in lots of different cultures, it doesn't match up perfectly. So, but at the same time, I feel like a lot of cultures, or maybe even all cultures, have some element of breaking down a dichotomy, is a useful dichotomy between what is revealed, which you can have agency over, and which is hidden, which is this contingency factor that never really control or access.
Yes. And part of what you're talking about that I think is right on here is the way that Roman men before the empire were used to thinking you could be forthright and say your opinion and so forth. But when it starts to become too dangerous to do that in the Civil War period and then the empire, then they resort to what they think of as female behavior, because that's the only roles they've left open to women in Roman society, which is to be sneaky and to create a difference between your brand or your persona to make an acceptable one, but then to hide
Right.
behind it your true character and your true intentions. That becomes the norm. And I'm sure you're right that in making this transition, they were following the example of their own mothers and sisters who had been forced into those kinds of roles centuries before by the
Right.
extreme patriarchy of Roman society. So they just sort of slipped right into, okay, we've already got a model to follow, which is,
Yeah. I think the other point that I wanted to make that wasn't maybe so clear is the way that when that behavior in society starts happening as a norm, it changes the definitions of words.
yes,
People's behaviors matches up to different words.
yes,
And so concepts literally change. And I think even their consciousness of what people expect about each other in terms of what changes and important is we can measure almost in a scientific, very noesis and very what's the best way I can think of it is the measure of transition for words in terms of their vocabulary is very much related to the level of accepted cognitive dissonance that's going
yes,
on in society. Like people are saying things and they realize that's not matching up to reality, and they're
yes,
using this sort of words as a cover, as a topology for a teleology that's just not really at all there anymore. It's something that used to be, or that people may be mythologize, but it's not. It's losing its ground. It's losing its momentum,
that's
and
right.
therefore it's going to create a power vacuum for something else to show up in its place.
Yes. Well, and to use the ancient Greek terminology for what you're saying, the Greeks would say that what happened under civil war and then imperial Rome is that the Roman language itself ceased to be a cosmos and became a chaos in which you don't know what people mean when
But
they
yeah,
say things anymore. And and when
yeah,
you can't even communicate, your capacity to form a society that can move in a single direction collapses. Um, so
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and this
So
is where it almost
sorry.
relate female being chaos and male being order, and that this overly mythologizing then order is amazing and all male behavior should be manly, ordered, rule based, which is half of reality. You need order and chaos to make cosmos in a healthy dynamic.
Exactly.
And
So that's collapsing at this period, and this is really how Kenneth justifies calling the Roman period not classical, not classical culture at its best, but classical culture in its decay, because
right,
all of the things that used to be virtues, like the Athenians just flat out telling the Melians what they intended, that's
right,
gone by the time you get into the imperial Rome, because people don't dare say exactly what's on their minds.
right. They use that as a weapon, as a chink in your armor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this is a thing in feudal Japanese culture. There are specific Japanese terms that distinguish between um, the the version of yourself that is your brand that you project to the world, and the version of yourself that stays hidden behind that brand. And
That's right.
Japanese corporations still use those words today to talk about the difference between who's allowed to speak for a company, how you
Oh,
craft the message for what your company is, and what do you conceal because it's not anybody else's business. Their whole concept comes from the same kind of dynamic in which in feudal Japan it could be dangerous to tell your lord exactly what was on your mind, and you had to
right.
learn to encapsulate your
Huh.
your 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 inner self. So
Is
it's
this the concept in Shintoism? You have three hearts: the heart that is revealed to others, which is the part you're supposed to say, the brand. And then there's a heart that you have just revealed for yourself. And then the third heart that you don't even have access to.
something like that. Yes, yes, yeah. On another day, I could tell you what two of those words are. I don't know the third one, but
Yeah.
so anyway, so this is a massive change in the ancient world that's
Yeah.
happened during the Roman period. So I'm gonna
Would
go
we,
with people in
I was
line,
going
but
to ask a last question. Would we say this is a when Latin is really decaying in this period, like at its greatest? If we had to measure, like on a, almost like a math curve, what's the point where there's the greatest amount of decay? Rate of decay is greatest. Is there a way we could try to guess when
oh
that's
yeah,
happening?
it's well documented. I mean, if you read articles on classical Latin, they easily make the distinction between Golden Age Latin, Silver Age Latin, and Late Latin. It's very
Mhm.
easy to tell the difference. Um, They're just and it has to do with the forthrightness and the honesty and also the originality of expression. Now, as people try to protect themselves in the Silver Age, they're still eloquent, but they give up originality of expression because they're sort of afraid to say what's on their mind. And by the late Latin period, they're both unoriginal and not all that clever in their expression. So you're losing both sides. It's neither artistic nor worth saying. So anyway, Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Thanks, Ari.
Yeah, so I think that the theme that I'll pick up on is I think the last point, because the revealed and concealed, and I think order and chaos is a better way of framing it. And I think that that's exactly kind of what was going on, is you always need a balance between the two. One of the things that you're seeing during this period of time is obviously there's a great expansion initially, and then all these borders that are essentially need to be maintained, and then the economics do come into play. But then you start to have your borders that you're unable to maintain, and then what do you need to do? You have to move to extreme order, right? So it's just a question of how that is going to manifest itself. And I think to link it back to the text, the important part here is to think about it where it ends up with things like Constantine, and kind of moving towards this idea of kind of this religious perspective, because that's a last attempt to order, in order to instill order where there is chaos. And this is really linked to the text, the way the conception of God changes. And that's where we have that period of time now. Then what is going to change? The information flows will absolutely change in that period of time too. And if you look at it from that perspective, then that's a radical shift. That's an extreme order. That's totalitarianism in a way. Your belief system is now this. So when you have that kind of belief system, then you have that type of information being flowed to people. Well, people have different values, and especially when your empire is that vast. And so when you start to have you have Roman values, you have religious values that are being introduced, and then you have the local customs that people have because your empire is so big. And what happens is they're in conflict with one another. And when this conflict occurs, and this becomes a completely unsustainable situation. So what happens is, again, your attempt to initially kind of answer the problem with this extreme order, kind of leads to its ultimate decline. And I think what this is about, you have to look at it as how values do change. And we can say that even, that economics does change values, and it even does change people's consciousness because of what they think is actually important. And that's not always going to end up in a very healthy way, because this is where, again, I've mentioned this in the past, how we look at information not as something as knowledge. We look at information as something as a commodity, and what can we extract from it in order to have, to monetize it. And so that's a very different way of looking the way information flows. So then, you have, again, you have the introduction of religion and a monotheistic kind of approach, an absolutist approach, was an extreme order approach, which kind of leaves everything to be out of balance. With chaos is not necessarily a bad thing. We look at it obviously sometimes in modern terms as a bad thing, but it's a balance between the two. You could even say that it's freedom to explore and understand the world under your terms. But again, if you introduce religion in this particular instance, then there's no freedom to explore. And so I think that this is an important part. And then the shift, and when we're talking about what Kenneth has written about in the past, about the shift in the perception of God itself. from the ancients to the Romans. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that.
Yes. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, that's definitely where we're going with paragraphs 8 and 9 here, for sure. Is this issue about why this change in the conception of God arises at this time? Why is it popularized? Why does it catch on? Why are the citizens under Roman rule ready to give up the Roman conception of the sacred and adopt this new conception? And they're more than ready. I mean, and paragraph 8 is setting us up for that. It's like, if you ask yourself, why would people throw away the glorious things we talked about in chapter 4? It's quite a conundrum. But if we look at what Rome was, which is a far cry from the glorious parts of chapter 4, we're like, well, this people are definitely ready to give up. I'm even reading about it. I want to give it up, on their behalf thousands of years later. It's like, oh my God. It's just, you can't have a clear conversation. So I put the quote in the chat from the speech of Calgacus from Tacitus's Agricola, where he talks about they make a desolation and they call it peace. And Agricola was a history of Tacitus's father-in-law, and he's writing this history because Agricola had great victories in Britain and was very popular and considered, the very model of a modern, Roman general. And then he was assassinated. And the widespread sense by Tacitus and others was it was the emperor who had Agricola killed out of envy and fear that he would be more popular than the emperor. And so they offed him. And so this history that that Tacitus is writing about, ostensibly about his father-in-law and his glorious victories in Britain, is actually a criticism of what's happened to Roman culture, that you can do everything right and be exactly who Roman culture tells you to be and still be punished for it.
Right.
By the state. He says, and this is his way of saying, he puts this speech in the mouth of Calgacus, and if you're an idealistic Roman, you could be inclined to read it all as bullshit, right? This is what our enemies say. But of course, what it's actually doing here is serving the purpose of making the enemy say the truth, and the truth is, it's just there's something seriously wrong in Rome. It's not okay. This isn't really an empire anymore. It's eating itself. It's not safe to be Roman. It's not even Roman anymore. We could call it a Roman Empire, but it's instead it's some sort of, it's auto cannibalism is what it is. And that's Tacitus' critique at the time. And this is one of his early books. I mean, his later books, where he actually goes into the histories of each of the Roman emperors, are fascinating. That's what I read back in 85, 86 when I was studying, taking my first history classes that I actually enjoyed. The professor had us read Tacitus after we read Thucydides, and reading about just emperor after emperor and the terrible things that they did. I didn't appreciate at the time what it meant that the guy writing that history was himself Roman, and this was his way of saying, there's something seriously wrong with us. We are not okay.
Just if I can add one really quick thing, something that Phil said in the beginning, that I thought was really also interesting, this idea of dealing with concepts and the practical, kind of linking. When you make this switch to extreme order, the concepts become fixed. So it's like you're no longer searching, you're no longer flexible. So that's how another way of information flows are kind of dictating what people's beliefs are. And so that's a big issue. Now, sometimes, again, they were in contradiction with some of the local customs, which also caused a problem. But that's a little bit different. But even if we're thinking about it today in modern terms, in the way the media actually has been sensationalized, and it's no longer reporting and giving information for people to then make the decisions on their own. A lot of these, again, news stations, are often just, they're telling you what to believe. And so people are seeking out what their bias is actually telling them.
Yes.
And so now that they're seeking out that, so the concepts, their version of reality is becoming fixed.
Yes.
And so their belief systems are becoming more entrenched, and it's actually creating a complete division. So you can kind of see that still kind of occurring, right? It's almost as if the political world has become religious
Yes.
in a way. And
Yeah.
so in a way,
Dogmatic.
yeah. And so you can kind of see what happens when the way information flows and what, but I think the fundamental thing that, when we think about all of these things is the when you're overextended, that people are going to, and you have a militaristic way of expansion,
Yes.
that ultimately you're going to revert to extreme order, and that breaks down at some point. And
Yes.
so that, and then, and there's various ways that that occurs. And so you could see that with Rome, and some would argue you could see that today.
Yes.
So
For sure. Yeah, I mean, that's what I lived through in the 40-year history inside the Department of Veterans Affairs, watching them retreat from the bold experiment of letting doctors and nurses and pharmacists write their own medical software, and instead retreating to the traditional, no, we must never write anything ourselves. We must only give money to the Beltway, because if we don't give money to the Beltway, then the Beltway won't fund the reelection campaigns of our presidents and Congress critters, who are the ones who decide what we're allowed to do and give us our budget inside the VA. So it becomes this incestuous,
Yes.
corporate welfare cycle as a retreat from, and of course the other part of that is the terror of managers of being held accountable for failure. So if they outsource everything, then the failure is not their fault. It's that other company. I outsourced to them. It was their job to do it right. Whereas if you're actually developing software in-house and something goes wrong, oh my God, why did I actually did something, oh my God, and it doesn't always succeed 100% of the time. How terrible. It's just, you must be
Right.
fine. There's this fear of accountability that causes people to want to play the Beltway game and outsource all responsibility. And of course, therefore, this is where you get the billions of dollars in waste, because at least it's safe for the managers, and at least it's supporting the reelection campaigns of the presidents and the Congress critters. So, all of this, what this has in common, I put a link again, and like Sofrosune, the other living horse I'm gonna keep petting is Samathacy. I think Nora Bateson gave us a word that the Greeks would like to have given us but didn't, and Samathacy is the word that means to be in a permanent learning relationship with your environment, in which when it changes, you notice and you change your behavior. And that's the definition of life. Better than any definition I've ever heard anywhere else. The idea that you are alive to what's happening around you so that you can adapt and respond. And that what's the reason that order is not the opposite of chaos, the reason, just following on what you said, the reason that order can be the source of chaos is that
Right.
when you get rigid, you stop responding to the world around you as it changes, because you're too locked down. You've ossified yourself. And now you're less like a living organism and more like a stone that just sits there and gets rained on because it can't respond to anything. It's too locked in. There's a Nietzsche talks about this about the Greeks a lot. He says in classical Greek culture, there is a vulnerability. To be alive to the world around you means you got to be able to say, I was wrong.
Right.
You got to be able to try things, make mistakes, learn from your mistakes. You got to be able to be wrong publicly and learn from that. You have to have that quality that, as we talked about at the very beginning of the 127 sessions, that an infant has, that live wire connection to the world that allows you to notice what's happening around you and care about it. When you have that, then you have Samathacy. But the more cool you become, the more powerful and imposing you become, the less Samathacy you have, and therefore the less alive you actually are. The more you're just, going through the motions and you're dead. Take care, Yana. It was good to have you on. Hope we see you again. So anyway, thanks for bringing that up, Joe.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's go to other folks we have in line. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to compliment Ari for bringing up something that I agree with, and it's actually very deep, and it has something to do with, well, I guess, the masculine and the feminine. I'm not sure whether we should label it that way, but nonetheless, it seems like, it reminds me very much of Heidegger's investigation of what being is. I guess he wrote a short book called The Inner Philosophy, The Beginning of Thinking, which means inner philosophy and in the metaphysics, the inner metaphysics and the beginning of thinking, because metaphysics began to be so oriented to a rational structure of ideas. And so what he seems to say is, at the beginning at least, it was like, at least for human beings, being, which guess is existing and in the human dimension, is the relationship between the questioning of what and the resolution of that, the relationship between what and that. Because we always, when we confronted with something new and strange and different, something that's, I guess, transcendental, we question like, what the hell is that? What is that? So there's always a relationship between the question, what, and then you finally, after looking at it for a while, doing whatever you need to do, it's, oh, that's what it is. That transition is very important because the relationship between the what and the that is the relationship between the revealed and the hidden. And so the visible and the invisible. The problem is that we have forced the whatness so much into the thatness that in a sense we've forgotten that there's a whole hell of a lot more in the whatness, which is the relationship of the finite being trying to figure out the infinite. Because infinite, there's a lot more whatness than thatness. I remember when I was studying at Berkeley and I was forced to take a language. I happened to retake Chinese, but unfortunately Mandarin, which is not my native tongue to begin with. One of my teachers said, there are three kinds of sentences. There are the declaratory, exclamatory, and then the interrogative. And I said, "Whoa, wait a minute." I said to myself, he mispronounced that interrogative. You mean the interrogative, the whatness of that. But he changed it. I began to think, well, maybe he's right. That the society had changed the interrogative, the whatness, into the interrogative. Like, you will tell me what that thing is, right? And we interrogate and change the whatness into the thatness. You get a prisoner, maybe a woman prisoner that realizes the whatness and interrogate, and we extract thatness from the whatness that shouldn't be extracted at that time. So that was very interesting, that his mispronunciation in the interrogative into the interrogative, changing the interrogative into a declarative statement. You will tell. Isn't that what we do with science? It's in some sense interrogate nature. And you will divulge your secrets into hiddenness. And that leads me to a very important person that we've forgotten, Artemis. Heraclitus left his writings at the temple of Artemis, not at the temple of Apollo or the temple of Dionysus. But in fact, human beings have developed this relationship between the balance of between the whatness and the thatness, and that's exactly what Artemis is, to extract, in some sense, in the hunt, some relationship and bring it. Unfortunately, it was seized by Apollo. So it was seized Apollo into a kind of thatness, is what the universe is, instead of like, because Artemis was not only a goddess, I guess the goddess Diana in the Roman form, but also she was a muse of the arts. It's kind of interesting how Heidegger has focused, given more attention to the arts, because the arts still have the ability to remain the hiddenness of the unrevealed. and to create the relationship with the whatness and the thatness in its manifestation. Whereas, like, unfortunately, metaphysics has almost covered over that relationship, and that's what he's trying to do, to in a sense, to re-establish the whatness so that it remains a viable situation. And you could see how this is transformed, because if you have Augustine, the mind of God already knows what the whatness is. There's all the thatness. If there was a divine city, the city of heaven, but unfortunately, human beings with philosophy, all we know is the relationship between the whatness and the thatness. And
Yes.
to revive that relationship is, in a sense, a badge of humility, you know, of of humility and uh, piety, that we don't know what the hell we're talking about. We only
Yes.
play with the relationship of the thatness and the whatness, and we should not emphasize it too much. And when you have a bunch of people making declarative statements, especially commands, then you have lost. You have lost the inquisitive aspect of what being human is. You have lost your piety because
Yeah,
you already know,
that's
but
right.
you don't know. Okay. So thank you, Ari, for reminding me the importance of Artemis, that we've kind of forgotten how
Yes.
important she was. By the way, it's a she. She was in
Yes,
relationship to that equivocation between the what and the that.
that's right.
So
So yeah, I agree. Thank you, Ari, for bringing that out. And thank you, Phil, for underscoring it for us.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Phil. That was great.
Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, I noticed that point you made about the Anglo-Saxon mind, and I've noted it myself. When they said men, they meant both sexes. And this changed when the Normans came and they were using French and they were going homs and femmes. Two very distinct words. The Anglo-Saxons, when they looked at the community, they thought, well, women were important. You can't have a community without women. Well, of course, famously in Blackadder, if you know the series, Hugh Laurie and the stupid Prince Regent goes to Blackadder. What sort of a jolly good time can you have with women that you can't have with men? And Blackadder goes, I cannot conceive, my lord.
That's great. That's really great.
But I was just going to bring up a point which is a little bit off topic, and this is this point Rudolf Steiner made about Nietzsche, about this huge transition that Nietzsche went. He started out as a typical philosopher, as a bit of a rationalist, a bit of an idealist. And he made this huge transition to what Steiner called dynamism. And most rationalists, this point Steiner was trying to point out, that Nietzsche had noticed that most people are rationalists and they think, oh, I've got this brilliant idea. Guess what? I'm going to make the entire world dance, dance to my tune. And Steiner's saying that the problem with this is you're stepping out with all your brilliant ideas and you don't understand foundation. Rationalists operate on the principle that they've got a context and you stand upon that context with your ideas. But the problem is rationalists make this huge mistake of thinking some little piddling group called humans in the universe, that their context is universal. And he said, sort of Nietzsche, that's what the later Nietzsche was on about, that, well, what are you standing on? Because when you step out of your own little world into the bigger world, it's a bit more like the carpet. It's not steady under you. It's being pulled out from under you. And this is a dynamic. yeah, sure, on one hand, you have your idea, but what are you standing on? What's the foundation? What's the context for your rationales? And this is the trouble, you notice, for example, the classic revolutionary, they're thinking for years, oh, when we get power, we'll set everything okay and right because the present government, the old regime's not doing anything. Because they got into power and they suddenly noticed that there's a dynamic there. The carpet has been pulled out from under them. And that's when they go crazy and they start guillotining everybody. Pol Pot gets into power.
Yeah.
He hasn't got a clue how to run it, even a small country.
Yeah.
Not a single clue. He can't deal with it. So I just thought I'd bring up that thing about Steiner and Dynanism. Yeah, getting back to the whole thing about Anglo-Saxons and the word man, they had that, what they call it, prefix,
Yes.
wir, W-I-R, which seems very similar to the Roman
Yes.
vir, but it means to war. So you have the women, you have the men with a womb, and there's this other type of men, and they do war.
Yes.
But
Well,
we
and
don't say that anymore. We don't use the weir man, right? We
yes.
just have women.
Yes. They had two names for men, for male men. One of them is Weirman, and you're right. It's there's too much overlap with VIR from Latin. It simply has to have been influenced by it. But they've also got WAP man, W ash P, the AE ash, and WAP man means the kind of man that has a weapon, and they meant it as a pun in exactly the same way Shakespeare does when he later has characters say, "Let me show you my dirk." It's like, no, that's okay, sweetie. Keep your dirk in your pants. That is exactly the joke that the Anglo-Saxons are making, is that the men who are male are the ones who carry a weapon. They might have a weapon in their hand, they might have a weapon between their legs, but at any rate, they're the when you need a weapon, you bring out a WAP man and send him to deal with the problem. But meanwhile, the female men were weef men, and weef meant weaver. Weaver. They were peace weavers. They were the ones who wove civilization together. And these are the same, Germanic culture. This is the same Germanic culture that among the Norse are conceiving of the weave of fate. So when they talk about weaving civilization together, they're also alluding to the idea that women are weaving this larger fate for all of us by creating this big context. And you're right, MANN, man, had no gender connotation at all. That meant a person, a human being. And English has suffered ever since the Norman conquest from the fact that we have no short, simple word for who we are. Human being, just like that. Human being. Why does it take 4 syllables to identify ourselves? It's awful. But anyway, yeah, it is a big change in gender dynamics. Not just Adelflaed either. There are other examples of Anglo-Saxon queens who were, they might, most of the time be, having councils and people talking to each other and going through the rituals, but you cross them and they would get the army together and invade Europe. It's just like, this is not part of the history that the patriarchal church people chose to tell later on, but it was understood that anybody, male or female, in pagan Anglo-Saxon culture might have to pick up the responsibility at any time to run the war, and then they did. It didn't matter what was between their legs. So gender roles can be very different depending on your culture. What is a man or a woman in Chinese culture? What is a man or a woman in Roman culture? What is a man or a woman in Mayan culture? These things, they all vary a lot. It's why for the kinds of things Ari's talking about, I kind of prefer yin and yang over male and female, and because
This is dynamic again. Yin and
yes,
yang is the dynamic.
exactly.
But yeah,
I
the
have to say,
Anglo-Saxons
I
seem
think
to the
I was
Anglo-Saxons
going to jump
seem to
in.
have this sort of concept of how things worked. The
Yes.
Normans come along, and it's power.
Right.
where you are in the hierarchy, and the Anglo-Saxons seem to have a view. Well, there's that village over there. It's a dynamic, as you said. It's a weave. There's a whole load of things going on there that make it a village. But to the Norman, oh, how much can I get out of it? What can it pay me?
Yes. Yes.
I
Thank you.
wanted to make the joke real fast. It seems like I threw myself under the bus with certain types of associations with gender and whatnot that were totally not my goal, other than to point out this sort of like mystical idea of hidden and revealed in the very Dirk versus not Dirk model, and
Yeah.
then everything else you guys can, yeah, you can anytime you need a gender situation gone wrong, just point it at the thing I talked about. It'd be great. Yeah.
I think we understood what you meant. I think we got it. You were talking about the actual objective state of men and women. You were talking about conceptions and models and so forth. So but it was entirely appropriate to discussion of Roman culture because the Romans had extremist concepts about the differences between men and women. So you got to take that into account when we're looking at all of these issues of what's happening in the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. We gotta be thinking the same kinds of dynamics you see in the mafia, the same kinds of dynamics you saw in Nazi Germany. The men have to be absolutely turned up to 11 masculine, and women have to be absolutely turned up to 11 feminine, or else everybody starts to get nervous and oh my God, the world's falling apart. Zelig, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
How's it going, Rick?
It's great to hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was listening to you guys about the power dynamics and then looking at the text, and it really I'm putting them together with the literature that was being read in the medieval era, and it reminds me that what was happening is that things were not working for the people in the medieval era. Things were going wrong. The classes that they were told they were no longer reaping the benefits of being in that class. The aristocrats, the plebeians, it wasn't working out. And like you were saying, they were getting punished for being who they were supposed to be. And it reminds me of, I was recently reading a passage when Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, and in Mark, and he's healing on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees are saying, "Hey, you're breaking the law. You're not supposed to heal on the Sabbath." And he's all like, "Well, haven't you actually read that David entered the temple and took some of the bread that is set before Yahweh, and him and his warriors ate the bread which was not permitted according to the law, and then the priests worked on the Sabbath to be able to have bread constantly before the Lord after they took it." And then he says somebody greater than the temple and Solomon and David is here. And in the sense, Jesus here says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, right? Man was made for, the Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath. And what's interesting is that we see the Roman Empire fall to the point where men were made for the laws instead of the laws for men. And that is what leads to a social order that becomes completely unbearable, where the laws no longer fit what's happening at the present moment because the laws are outdated, or they're just too many to be able to put them in such a way that benefit or solve the situation. And this is where Kenneth's undercurrent of Philip Reef is important, because Philip Reef in his trilogies, Social Order, Sacred Order, says that a functioning society that is run by the sacred order, right? What he would call revelational law, right? The law from Mount Zion, where God is revealing his law to a social order, to a people, has to have what he called the interdicts, which are the commandments, like you should not kill, you should not commit adultery, right? There's specific knowledge claims, like you should not steal, you should not murder because it's evil. And then there's also transgressions, which is killing, murdering, stealing, adultery, right? The breaking of those positive laws. And then what's interesting, he calls remissive laws, where you're permitted to break the law due to the circumstances that you can't do no other. So, for example, the story of here comes the Nazis, and you're a German hiding away some Jewish people. The moral thing to do is to tell the truth. However, you lie and you say, "Yeah, there's no Jews in my house." That is a remissive permission that what Philip Brief would call, because being honest at that moment would lead to the loss of life. And so, and tying it back to Jesus, him and his people were actually plucking food in the Sabbath and healing on the Sabbath to promote life, not death. And so I think that when the Roman law came to a point of like, we need to just observe the law, but yet they were killing life in the process of promoting law, that is where societies start to break down, right? Where bureaucracies, just observing bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake, even if it destroys and murders life, that's where it starts to fall apart. And I think that's what was started to happen to Rome, that they were just observing the man was made for the law, not the law for men. And I think we're living in a little bit of that society, to bring it to our present moment, where we no longer preserve life. We don't believe we pay taxes to preserve life. That we just pay taxes to keep the machine going, and that leads to very atrocious things like supporting wars that are not meant to. What is called just war theory, right? That we take life to preserve life. Ironically, in this fallen world, we're no longer doing that. We're starting wars to take someone's oil or someone's land. And so I think Reef's idea, and Kenneth understood this, a society must have remissive aspects of it, where it allows you to break the law so that you can preserve life. And once you don't have that, once you only have interdicts and transgressions, rewards and punishments, and no mercy or forgiveness, your society breaks down. And I think that's what happened to Rome.
Thank you, Zelig. I'm gonna, before I go to the next hands, I'm gonna just, in the interests of medievalism, I'm gonna drop a couple of links in the chat that are apropos of nothing we're talking about, and then I'll go back to what everybody's doing. The first is one of my very favorite albums, is composed by Richard Einhorn. It's called Voices of Light. And those of you who don't know about it, he stumbled upon, in the Library of Congress in the basement, he was there one summer, and he stumbled upon a film that had been lost for a long time called The Passion of Joan of Arc. And he watched it, and he was so blown away. It was a silent black and white film. He's so blown away by it that he then dedicated the next several years of his life to composing a soundtrack to go to it. And it is a depiction. He basically put together a musical portrait of Joan of Arc and her life that could be played alongside the film. And for that, he draws the texts from medieval sources exclusively. So some of the text is from the letters of Joan of Arc, and some of it's from the trial, some of it's from female mystics, or from male church fathers writing about how evil women are. There's all kinds of different passages in it, and it's incredibly powerful and incredibly beautifully performed. And the end result is then the film itself is now available on YouTube and elsewhere with that soundtrack. So you can watch the silent black and white film with the music alongside it. And it is something I'm going to come back to repeatedly over the next 2 years. So I think it's one of the best depictions of the medieval perspective I've ever seen. You know, Joan of Arc's life really captures a lot of the dynamics of what's going on with the medieval worldview and the medieval epoch in particular. So I'm just checking that out there because we've been talking about gender relationships. And you know, if you buy the album, you get the booklet, and the booklet includes all the lyrics and the translations, and the song that talks about how you shouldn't trust Joan of Arc because she's a woman, and you know how evil women are, such sinners, and they're disgusting and they're horrible, and all of that stuff. The way that it's sung with that particular song with such hatred and venom. And it was not written by an extremist. That was mainstream. That was the mainstream church and its position. during certain periods in the medieval period. That's how contemptuous it was of women. And it's important to understand that when we look at the medieval epoch. And we know that that didn't come from nowhere. It came from several sources, and one of the sources, it came from the misogyny of the Roman Empire. You know, when the Orthodox branch of Christianity rose to prominence, became the dominant form of Christianity, and then took over the empire, the marriage resulted in this, 1,000 years of official misogyny down the center line of the medieval epoch. Now, around that center line, there was all this non-misogynistic versions of Christianity that were happening at the same time, for a variety of reasons. Women mystics, people who didn't buy into the orthodoxy, and you got things like Joan of Arc, where you get a peasant girl suddenly is inspiring, people to form an army and kick the English out of France. This kind of thing is happening at the same time that you've got this venom in the official received position. So these kinds of paradoxes that we see kind of dramatized during the medieval period, they have their roots in the Roman Empire and its misogyny and treatment of women. So we'll come to that. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, first of all, I just a quick comment on your thing about Joan of Arc. That's a really, really powerful film by Theodor Dreyer, probably the greatest Swedish filmmaker in history.
It's one of my
even
favorites.
above Ingmar Bergman. So I recommend that. But now for what I want to say is that let me correct. Let's see, Ari. Maybe he shouldn't use the word between male and female, men and women, but more like masculine and feminine, because all of us possess those qualities. It seems to me like, yeah, the feminine are the weavers in a funny way, in a kind of much more deferring to a broader culture, a broader relationship, whereas the masculine is much more immediate about its relationships. And I think if you look at it that way, it just seems like it reminds me of Jacques Derrida. Now, I'm going to disagree with Jacques Derrida to a degree because he puts it all on the text. But insofar as text has become so dominant in our relationship with concepts, maybe that was a good idea. But in relationship to reality, I think is even better, because he used the word difference, but he pronounced it différance in French. And that's a very, very important change, because he's not only identifying that one should not only listen to the main stem of what things are, but the difference, the displacement of that, in other words, the being and the otherness is part of being itself. So once again, the parent and the hidden. But difference also includes the word deference. The difference in deferring. In other words, you always give way and defer to something else so that it eventually comes back around to what the thing is. So in a sense, sustaining things by deferring to, and human beings being finite powers are always deferring the absolute truth because we are progressing. So therefore, we could always only not say, oh, this is what it is. We've got it. We got the answer. It's the king dollar or whatever it is, But you take that in consideration and you always defer the fact that there is more to go. You deferred it in order to create the web of existence. So that deference is absolutely a part of what is, what you're saying is probably true, but maybe we shouldn't take it as absolute truth, like there is a difference that's still embedded and so therefore we should just make that as a possible answer with a question mark after it. That is deference, deferring to a future resolution. So we are constantly living in a culture, if you want to take it authentically, of deferring our answers to the questions that we ask. The being is always, in some sense, the whatness that has been deferred for the thatness. The thatness must defer to the whatness. So the deferring is important. If you don't exist in the thing that, yeah, maybe I shouldn't take this as absolute true. Let me put all my money in this particular stock, then
Yeah.
you are going wholesale. Maybe you'll get lucky, but I would suggest the correct thing to do is, even if you believe in it very strongly, put 50% in and hold back some of to some other stocks, to cash or whatever that is deferring, in order to, in a sense, have a safety net for your mistaken identity, because you're a human being. You don't know what the hell's going on. Absolutely. You only have a pretty strong hint that it might be this way.
Yes.
So take life with a certain degree of deferring to maybe the opinions of others, maybe just to unknown future. Okay. Difference. So,
Thank you,
but
Phil.
to the degree that we're all capsulating, we capture by the linguistics, maybe putting the stress on deferring the language itself is not absolute in its own manifestation. So that's Jacques Derrida, and I'm not a disciple of Jacques Derrida, but I take that advice. The otherness is always being deferred.
Thank you, Phil. Zelig, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I would like to comment on Phil. I've actually read a lot of Derrida. In my early 20s, I spent trying to understand him. And at the beginning, I thought that he really did believe that we can defer on meaning, right? And until he got into a fight with his professor Michel Foucault, and subsequently he actually tried to justify that the guy that he knew, Paul de Man, was not an actual Nazi, but he actually was an actual Nazi. He had actually committed fraud in his academic career to hide the fact that during the Reich of Hitler, he was actually writing for a Nazi newspaper. And Paul de Man hid that fact from Jacques Derrida. And when everyone found out that Paul de Man was actually a Nazi, Jacques Derrida lost a lot of credibility because he tried to apply his deconstruction method to the newspaper of Paul de Man of Nazism and tried to say that Paul de Man was actually promoting anti-Nazi ideas when he wasn't. He was literally promoting and propagating Nazi propaganda, anti-Semitism. And so a lot of people lost respect for Derrida in that instance. And then I read Grammatology, his most famous work. And he actually does say in Grammatology that, yes, you can actually know the historical absolute meaning of a text. He says there's no dispute about that. However, we can choose always to expand the context. But if we decide to freeze the frame, we can actually know the historical absolute truth of what happened in Nazi Germany, for example. We can know who Hitler was, what he taught, and we can always say Hitler was anti-Semitic. And his controversial take was that, well, can we actually make Hitler eventually in history the good guy? And when he lost his credibility, Jacques Derrida is when he basically said, yeah, 1,000 years from now, we can probably make Hitler non-anti-Semitic. That's where everybody lost the plot with Jacques Derrida, because when you apply his deconstruction method, then that means that we can make Hitler a good guy eventually. So that's what I learned, and I spent like 5 years reading Derrida. And like I'm a big fan of Derrida. I like his way of thinking. He's open-minded, but eventually it's like, yeah, eventually me saying that, yeah, like Hitler, we can turn Hitler into a good guy with deconstruction. I was like, nah, I'm not gonna go that far with you. I'm gonna get off this train here, Derrida.
That is a bridge too far. Sorry, Jacques. See ya. Thanks for that, Zelig. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. So, I just find the idea of whatness and thatness actually to be, pretty insightful in this particular instance, because I think that Yeah, when you move to thatness actually works for a short period of time, but it's not something that's sustainable. And to Stephen's point a little bit earlier, when he was talking about Nietzsche and the dynamicism aspect of things, right? You lose dynamicism when you actually only point to the thatness. And then so what happens is that which is kind of it, you've seen that happen over time with whether we were as we were talking about it in terms of the Roman Empire, also as well as even if you want to say even during the industrial age, you can kind of see where we hang on to the thatness, and the inability to evolve from that. You can kind of see it even in today's world, in the sense that the way we even look at things like infrastructure, and the way things they're supposed to be that, right? And we're not no longer thinking about what something is, and you're kind of locked in. And then when it starts to hit its critical mass, and then you can kind of start to see things fall apart as well. But I also think that this kind of applies to this male and female like dynamic too. When we start to see these two not working in unison, you start to say it's that. And this is where I have like kind of an issue where sometimes like people say, well, men do this or women do that. And then it's like, well, you're saying that at that point, you're kind of categorizing in a way, not to say that there aren't categories, not to say there isn't differences, but when you start putting it in societal terms, then it changes, like the dynamic changes, because you're putting it within the system that it currently exists, not within nature, right? So instead of seeing this as a whole that kind of works together, you end up having, assigning roles almost. And it's that, this is what women are supposed to do. This is what men are supposed to do. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. That's not necessary. Those are artificial constructs. So I think that that's an important concept when we're talking about the loss of flexibility, and Phil's opening comments, again, to come back to those briefly, is that the loss of not dealing with concepts and only dealing in kind of the practical. And so then what happens is that ideas that the concepts themselves kind of get distorted. So I think that that's an important part, kind of like maybe not distorting our perspective, and keeping and maintaining a dynamic relationship between the masculine and the feminine. And I like the yin and yang as well, as the way you put it earlier, Rick. This is an important part of that. And this comes down to words and language. And so, because I think that sometimes shapes our, obviously it does shape our perception of reality. Anyway, I know nothing earth shattering, just wanted to share that.
It's good, Joe. Thanks. And then Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, I'll try to be very brief, unlike me, but I want to say, firstly, really respond to Zelig, and a shout out there. I love it. Your share was awesome, specifically talking about Derrida and Foucault. They're some of my favorites too. I really like studying linguistics through Derrida, and specifically the part about how Hitler can be seen as a good guy 1,000 years from now. To me, I want to, as a Jew, especially as a pretty religious Jew, I totally validate that statement. And there's a historical journalist who does a really awesome comparison, doing a whole episode on this exact concept. And his name is Dan Carlin, and he did Hardcore History, which is kind of popular, but also very exciting, and does a lot of what we do from ancient stuff. He deconstructs it in a very thoughtful and very creative yet robust way. And one of the things he talks about is he's very confident and brings a lot of sources and evidence that Alexander the Great at his time was thought of very much like as Hitler, that he was such a destabilizer of everything that was, and used really, really nasty, persuasive, charismatic, narcissistic ways, like getting the Oracle to say what he wanted it to say for him, and then broadcasting his story through all of their religious mediums, that he was some form of their god, and being very successful in this. I can only imagine that he was very much seen as a Hitler, also because he openly revels in the slaughter. He just wants to kill as many people as he can, because that's what's best in life, kind of attitude. In a very ancient, appropriate way, but the things that we would find absolutely completely evil in our modern day. And so he declares very similarly, like, who's to say, as especially a history is written by the victors, and that perception of culture is very much through understanding of vocabulary and language. Who's to say it's very, very easy that the filtering of information could come 1,000 years from now? Hitler might be, some, you have no idea. He could be anything from a Darth Vader who's just this cool character to an actual, like, you know, demon, or who knows? He could be very much like he is. There's no way of telling the way history is going to tell us in the future, but it's very likely that we could be changing Hitler into an Alexander the Great in 1,000 years, no problem. And I really liked that whole thing with Derrida and meaning, and of course Phil's difference. So we're always deferring meaning, and this makes sense as we're always updating the future, and the future automatically rewrites the past. That's kind of the nature of redemption in religious idea, that some future event will change. And this makes a lot of sense if you're, working for a long time to try and make a great something or other, and then you make the great something or other, like, oh, that justifies everything you did. Or if you never make the great something or other and you waste your whole life, that also keeps that story that way. So it's the future very much determines the meaning of the past. And I thought Derrida was like spot on with this. And I do find it almost embarrassingly similar that I could have been fooled by this guy who was not a Nazi, who was really a Nazi, who, I feel like that could have happened to me. So, yeah. Anyways, very cool shares, Zelig. I really like that.
Yeah, that was great. That was great, Zelig, and thanks for highlighting it for us, Ari. You're right. It was very important. James, welcome. Tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you, Rick, and everybody. I wanted to ask a couple of questions regarding first Derrida and also about the Roman Empire. Regarding Derrida, this idea of deferring, would that be something like what Heidegger means by the what, the essence of existence and so forth, and that for Derrida it meant kind of the existentialist question, the issue of existence, right, comes first, and then you create your essence, the meaning of life, a meaning of truth, and so forth. And so, for Derrida, it would be something like, we can never arrive at an absolute truth that you can be settled on, and so you have to defer that, right? So it's always a process of deferring, because you're always questioning, and things are all constantly changing. You can arrive at some sense of what the meaning is, what the essence is, but it's never settled. It has to be deferred. And isn't that what Heidegger means by the what? The what is the essence that has been traditionally been assumed and asserted. It's a form of idealism, isn't it? To be able to posit the truth, the ideal, the ultimate ideal truth, and to assume that is how you should live your life, and it kind of ignoring that which is the existence. Existence is constantly in a state of flux, and that Heidegger is critiquing the whole tradition of Western philosophy in terms of assuming there's what, and that we should focus on that before we can arrive at what the essence is. And would you say that the Roman Empire was influenced by Plato's idealism? That it is a kind of assumption that they know what the truth is, which Plato pretty much builds a whole structure of politics in the Republic. That there is this structure, and there are the philosopher kings that are the rulers, and they know what the truth is. and just as Plato assumed that he knew the truth of the forms, the ideal forms of the ideal essence, the what, and therefore you just operate from there, based on this assumption of knowledge, and then build a structure on that. Wouldn't you say that the Roman Empire was influenced by that, the worst of what maybe Plato was saying about politics?
It's a good
And
question.
they extracted the worst of that kind of view of politics, and just ran the empire based on dictatorship and this kind of ideal state.
It's a good question, James. I'm still learning about the Roman Empire. I mean, despite the fact I've been studying it off and on for, I guess, 40 years now. Um, but now that I'm studying Latin, I'm learning more about it. I'm doing reading I never did before. I'm learning parts of the history I never learned before, and it's gonna. I think my understanding of this is going to change dramatically. But what I've got so far as of today, I don't. I think that the Roman medieval Christian church, especially after Augustine, is heavily influenced by Plato's ideas. But I'm less convinced that the Roman Empire before Christianity was. And the reason is so many of the things that they do politically in when they change from one stage of development to the next seem hyper determined by the immediate preceding crisis. Like Augustus's seizing power, which I used to see in an abstract way, I now see as a desperation move, as a response to the just relentless civil wars that were breaking out beforehand. And I wonder to what extent the way that the average Roman at the beginning of his reign saw things was not that he was a philosopher king, but thank God somebody who could put an end to the civil wars. And it's kind of a crisis. The empire at its height, at its peak, and its most glorious moment, the way that it's usually taught today, really starts to look to me like a crisis response more than anything else. And each succeeding emperor really has that same their rules have that same feeling of we are barely holding things together. You look at the decay into Caligula, and then the rapid period of turnover, almost civil wars again, before you start up the Flavian dynasty, and then it barely gets to its third emperor before it's all changed again. There's this constant feeling of a tightrope act, carrying too many things, and you're constantly on the edge of falling off. And so I think the medieval church, I think, is maybe more informed by Plato's ideas. The Roman Empire was happy to dress up in anything from one moment to the next. Even in the Republican period before that, they were happy to put on fads and fashions, but their commitment to these ideas it was skin deep. Whereas I think that the medieval Christian orthodoxy's commitments to Plato is deeper than skin deep. Like they might actually be into it. They might need it and care about it. And that might be why they've got all these monks laboriously copying copies this dialogues over and over, as they're like, without this, we're screwed. Whereas the Romans are just putting it on like the fashion of the day. I guess that would be my assessment of the difference between. But ask me again in a year after I've done more reading, and I might change my take on it.
Yeah, there might be a kind of repetition of that same kind of idealism. The guy wrote this book we're going to be reading by Robert Pippin, called The Culmination, Heidegger and the idealism and the German idealism and the fate of philosophy. I think his point is that the Hegel represents the culmination of this kind of idealism. And that kind of idealism maybe was what also led up to the to the Nazi um, Nazi movement, perhaps. That's just.
Yeah.
But it seems like it makes sense that Hegel would be a kind of culmination of this form of Platonic idealism. If you want to look at it, like from the whole perspective of that historical, kind of a bird's eye view or God's eye view of Western history.
Yeah, in my 20s and 30s, I had been introduced to Hegel, in the context of Marx, where Marx is the, good scientific materialist and Hegel is the crazy idealist whose feet aren't on the ground, and Marx has to, turn Hegel right side up to put his feet on the ground in order to create dialectical materialism. But the more I read about Hegel, the less clear I am that that's an accurate, assessment. It might be a very Marxist friendly assessment, but I think maybe a more accurate assessment is that Hegel's trying to put nature into Kant's conception of the mind. He's trying to put the stages of development, the actual concrete reality of the world into the way that we think about thinking and philosophy and the mind. And you see that with his recurrence to the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. He's like, Kant is describing this idealized, perfect intellectual mind, but where the hell does it come from? It doesn't emerge fully grown from the forehead of Zeus. It has to develop. And what does it develop from? When you look at an infant, a newborn infant crying, do you see Kant's perfected intellectual? I mean, we don't, right? So, when by basically bending Kant into the shape of nature, in order to show the stages of development, I wonder if, contrary to what I was taught in my 20s, if Hegel isn't trying to be more materialistic and show how does nature actually work at a concrete level. Plus, there's all his comments in the philosophy of Geist, where he basically says gnosis, or what he calls begriff, is concrete and tangible and real. But the more you get into Verstand and abstract intellectualizing, the more he says to abstract is to be in error. That's a very, if he was the idealist that Marxists paint him as, that would be a very strange thing for him to say. He should be saying to abstract is to be close to God and perfect, and you should always be abstract and systematic. But instead, he's saying, "Wow, that way lies dragons." Be very, very careful when you try to think too much.
Well, of course, he does ultimately arrive at an absolute, right? An absolute position where it is a form of, it's a manifestation of his form of idealism. And you could also say that Marxism is a kind of incorporates a form of idealism too, where there's different interpretations, but you have the various interpretations by Stalin and Pol Pot, and who just ignored the material, facts of human beings, and this slaughters human beings in order to achieve this kind of utopian ideal.
Yeah, doing math with human beings always gets you in trouble. But I'm gonna save most of that for the modern discussion in a couple of years from now. The Hegel part, I wonder sometimes whether Hegel feels like an idealist because translating him into English we lose so much, and all the tangible stuff. Like his concept of the absolute is closely related to creating a dialectic between your abstract ideas and the tangible reality, the concrete, the begriff, the tangible concrete information coming to you through your senses and your experience of life. And that dialectic is less an idealist position than it is it's like a Heraclitean position. It's like the position of science that says you have to make your ideas be tempered by reality. And so that particular kind of palintropy is neither idealistic nor materialistic, but instead it's saying both idealism and materialism are sins intellectually, and you have to harness them to each other to be self-correcting to have any chance of getting access to reality. But I think most of that's lost when you turn it into English, where we just don't have the words, and you get these weird words like notion and idea and absolute, and God knows what if he were writing that in English, God knows what he would have meant by it all. It's part of the reason why, if I live long enough, I want to take another stab at creating a translation of Hegel to see if it can be done without turning him into a caricature, like the way that art translations do.
Yeah, this book called The Culmination is a pretty recent edition. So we can talk more about this as we read this book.
Oh yeah, that'd be great, James. Thank you. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I've identified as Sharon, and I'm going to talk about the text. I'm thinking this paragraph 8, which we're still on, finishes off with Hobbes, with my little favourite, man is wolf to man, and I think we've got a couple of choices here. We can discuss this concept, which I really love. Man is wolf to man. I just love that concept. Or we can deal with that a bit at some length, or we can deal with it shortly, and then we can, put up on the board paragraph 9. Thank you.
I love it. Yes, let's do it. Let's do it. We got some more hands though first. So I guess we'll come to that in a moment. Actually, Donna, you put your hand down, but why don't you go? Because you haven't spoken yet today, and then I'll come to Phil. If you can come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hopefully I won't. Yeah. First, I apologize. I was coming in late, merging two systems, and that was all the back talk. I think I had to get off, but sorry about that. Yeah, I want to say I appreciate your weaving the personality and the context of the personality back and forth into the larger history of what we're talking about. Because, well, whenever I study a philosopher, I have to understand a bit more of where they sit in history and the context of how they're operating and get some sense of them as a human being. And you've done this repeatedly. I appreciate it because it satisfies my mind in any case. Again, not trying to be a cheerleader, but when I hear you say that, it helps me understand a bit more. I think that's all I want to say because we're running out of time. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Donna. It's good feedback. I mean, it's more than cheerleading. It's good feedback to hear kind of what's working for people, and it helps me to focus.
It is for me. Yep.
So thank you, Donna.
Mm-hmm.
Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
What's on my mind is to make sure that we don't throw Plato into the medieval context too much, because I think, first of all, Augustine, I think, was in the third century AD, so that was 300 years after Christ. So the church had existed sort of, at least in the first period, as somewhat underground, but then it slowly evolved into being sort of accepted by the Romans. And I think it was not until after Augustine, maybe the 4th century AD, maybe even the 5th, but the 4th, when the Romans were really falling apart. And it seems to me they needed each other, because the Christian community needed the institutions to stabilize it and ride it in relationship to the actual existence in the culture. And the Romans needed Augustine to give it a concept that's much more than just being barbarians. And so that synthesis was very, very important. It happened when actually Rome was actually falling apart from the Huns. And so I think that came later. So, but Plato, I think the version that they got Plato is not Plato, but Platonism, which is very much influenced by Plotinus. So they got one that was already infused with a lot of mystical religion before Christianity, in a sense. And they didn't get the true Plato, who was actually teaching philosophy, until after the the Arabs, the medievals, got a sense of the true Plato, or Aristotle, as a matter of fact. So they got a delayed version, and they got Plato first because they always had Plato as a structure, and they needed that, in a sense, to justify, in a sense, Augustine's relationship to the existential world. But on the other hand, I think, and they really abuse Aristotle, because they turned Aristotle into a Platonist as well as Plato into a Platonist. So you didn't get Plato. Plato was really just trying to deal with the situation at hand as a human being, because he never really defined what the forms were. And the best we could make of it is uh, Mereology was the relationship parts of other parts of the whole, and that came later in terms of science. And I think that's what he's talking about. How you might want to ask, like, how does relating the parts to other parts of the whole actually get you a divine order? No, it doesn't. It gets you a functional order. As an example, you know,
Right.
how do you have a bicycle? That's a whole bicycle. Well, you have the handlebars, you have the frame, you have the wheels, you have the gears, all that kind of stuff. In the right way, you have a functional bicycle. That's the form of a bicycle. That's not the divine cosmic form of everything. It's just
Yeah.
a form of things that actually appear in the world as it is. And
Yeah.
so that's a very, very important concept that we have. The form of the table, the form of a chair, the form of this and that. These are all practical things that actually exist, and you actually understand it, because to just have the spare parts. Imagine if you went to the store and you got all of the spare parts to make a car, but you don't know how the jigsaw puzzle it together. You just have a junkyard. You do not have an automobile. You do
Right.
not have all sorts of things. That's a very, very important distinction between less. Oh yeah, you just have a hotline to God and He'll tell you how to make an automobile. And that's what the medieval gave you. You got to have that hotline. And that's exactly what the high priest, the Pope, does. He
Right.
has the one and only hotline. And you better then listen to what he said, because he's the direct messenger to the divine understanding. So that's a very, very different combination. So
It sure
please
is.
don't misunderstand that.
Thanks for bringing that up, Phil. It's an important reminder. Hey, Donald, somebody mentioned Plato. Come off mute and tell us about it.
James, you should read my book on the Republic that explains why the Republic shows us that we'll never have a just society, that the prerequisites for producing philosopher kings can't be met. Of course, I never wrote that book. I only mention it from time to time, not the book, but but yeah, Phil has just he's left me speechless. He's so upped his Plato game that I'm in awe. But yeah, I think Plato and Aristotle were both struggling with a problem of how do you become a good man once society is collapsing? That you no longer, I mean, this stuff is all from the 300 BCs, Plato and Aristotle. It's not from the glorious 5th century. It's from, maybe it's romanticized. I don't know. And then, as I think Phil's quite right. I mean, Aristotle had the unmoved mover, a proof of sort of the existence of God. And what's God like? Well, he's like the Plato's idea of the good, you know, that provides form, goodness for the world, and it's just the big convolution of two things they didn't understand. Well, if you don't understand either one, they might as well be the same. Two two things you can't recognize can be the same thing to you, to whoever's seeing it. So yeah, I don't know where this really goes, but I think James said earlier that Plato had a sense of the truth. Plato proposes far more questions than he does answers. He's a philosopher. He's aristocratic, he's Greek, but he lives in a polis that's collapsed, in a civilization that's collapsing. I don't know. I think you see the Romans being more akin to sort of just, how do we just get by? You know, that they're not concerned with how do we build a just society. In fact, I think that kind of explains why Kenneth Smith, the Romans philosophically are very uninteresting. I mean, you can read Heraclitus, you can read Plato, you read Aristotle, and you go, my God, what kind of civilization produced such people? And then you can read the best the Romans have, and it's sort of like, spend less than you earn, marry a good wife, you know, don't build too big a house, you know. So I don't know. It's certainly, there's certainly a de-scoping of what philosophy should concern itself with.
Well, let me add something to that. I mean, like, wasn't his teacher Socrates, who the oracle says you are the wisest man in the world? And he knew that he didn't know anything. So therefore, how could he be wise? The answer is like to know yourself,
Right.
how incomplete you are. To know yourself. That sounds like to know your own character in some sense.
Yes, Phil. Your knowledge of Plato is just grown by leaps and bounds. You leave me with nothing to say.
You have the Donald seal of Plato approval.
I doubt that's true that I leave you nothing to say. Just because you say little doesn't mean you don't know more.
Thank you both. Hey, James, what's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks. I have a lot of questions about Plato. I haven't read enough of Plato myself, but didn't Plato, argue in a certain form of monotheism by positing that there are forms that are outside of this world that are conditioning that are responsible for what we understand about this world, and that before that there was polytheism, right? There was many gods, and we don't know which one is. There's not one God that's telling us what is real and so forth. But for Plato, he said that by your rational this process of rational dialectic, you can arrive at the truth of what the forms are, and it's mathematical. It's there in the but not in this world. It's beyond the divide. It's a beyond the dividing line, right? There's the division between two worlds, this world and the world on the other side of the line. That's the metaphysical world, right? Isn't that what has run through throughout the tradition of philosophy and also culture in the West? That's my, kind of like very scattered understanding, but just just that basic notion that there is this one truth, the form that is responsible for that, responsible for what exists in the world, and what makes up a chair is a copy, right? A chair is just a copy of what the form of the chair is, right?
I would say, James, that's what we often get is Plato from Augustine through medieval Catholicism, and is sometimes taught. I would say that the forms, I don't know that Plato ever, I don't really got it together on the forms. The forms, when I see it first introduced in dialogues, it's things like what's a bee? Well, let's go get all the bees and we'll look at them, and then we can figure out what a bee is. Well, how do you know that what you've got are all the bees? You need some idea. You already have to know what the bees are to go get them, to look at them. There's kind of a circle there of the one concept and the many instances. And Plato is trying to make sense of how we can do this. And he takes, I think, some guidance from artists, not what we think of art, but technicians. The guy that makes a pot, he has some idea of what the pot's going to look like, and it guides his handiwork. The carpenter, all of these trades, that what we think of as trades, artisans, are guided by some idea. And does that, can you move that and get to other ideas that make a coherent metaphysical something or other? It's easier for me to see the problem that Plato is trying to grapple with, of how we don't end up with a junkyard, we end up with a car, than it is to say that he knows the absolute truth about what is the good in the world. Because I think he would say, yeah, we can build cars, but we may not know absolute truths. I mean, one of the strongest statements that Socrates ever makes at the end of his life in the Apology is where he says, and no person has ever presented me an argument that convinces me that it's better to harm someone rather than to do good for them. And that's it. He doesn't say, well, this is some absolute truth. He says, nobody's ever presented an argument that would persuade me not to believe this. I think, mostly you'd say, well, that's a pretty low bar. But mostly it's a bar that almost nobody can achieve. Most people have heard arguments that show them that they're wrong, 3 or 4 times a day, and it doesn't change their behavior or their thinking one whit. So, well, I don't know. I think you should just read more Plato differently. That don't go read like Karl Popper's the Open Society and Its Enemies, about how Plato is this Greek fascist that is wanting to destroy modernity. Not that Plato wouldn't destroy modernity if we understood him correctly, but
not for fascist reasons.
no. Okay, I'm sorry, James. That's enough. But I think there are many other ways to read Plato that don't lead to the conclusion that you drew.
Well, I think another way to say what you're saying, Donald, is, we have the problem with Plato that we have with Hegel and that we have with so many of these authors, which is the attempts to summarize them and translate them into English fail more often than the translators and summarizers think they do.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was reading something the other day, a history of Greece, starting with the Persian Wars and then going on, and the guy is citing something about Greek culture, and he has a quote from Plato, and he says it's the Benjamin Jowett translation, which is probably the worst possible. It's out of copyright. That's why it's used. It's also almost inaccurate in every sentence. You know, it's like
It's not a clear
except for
sentence
the
to put
A's
down.
and except for A and the. You know, it gets a lot of stuff wrong.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's just too many people just don't appreciate the difficulty of translation. But I mean, I guess ultimately that's what Kenneth Smith's book here is about. Is it saying it's not just a simple mechanical process. They literally see the world a different way than we do. Their words all mean different things than we think they do. We can make a little lexicon that says this Greek word equals this English word, but the lexicon, that doesn't make the lexicon correct. Just because we have it and we use it doesn't mean it's right. And, you know, some of that, I guess we'll get to it next time. Some of that comes into play with how we're going to wrap up paragraph 8 and talk about paragraph 9.
There's a little story about some guy who was in Little's Greek class, and they were given a translation exercise, and the guy translated the text and he turned it in, and Little gave it a very low grade for having mistranslated so much of the Greek. And the student protests, saying that, well, I used Little and Scott's lexicon as the basis of this translation. And he says, I think you used too many citations by Scott. His were wrong.
Not enough by Little.
yeah. Of course, they're not marked in there who did which. I don't know.
That's hilarious. Thanks, Donald. I know we have hands, but we're also out of time. We're out of time, Phil. We're out of time, Stephen. We have to wrap up for today. So
I'm just going to say you guys are going to have to spend the next week thinking about man is wolf to man. I want you to meditate on that. And then we can
yes.
finish this paragraph.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. That's where we're gonna pick it up next week, is right on
Well,
what Stephen said.
I'll say that time does constrain all human existence. So I
It
accept
does,
that.
doesn't it? So with that, thank you everybody. I hope you had a good time. I always agree with Ari, and now I'm sort of channeling Ari the same way that Stephen channeled Sharon earlier in saying this is the highlight of my week, and I love spending time with you all. So take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Amen. Preach on.
Have a great week.
Have a great week.